Hey there, history hunters. The early 1800s. China is the biggest, richest country on the planet, around 14.5 million square kilometers, roughly 450 million people, about 1 in every 3 humans alive, sitting on a third of all the wealth on Earth. The Qing emperors rule what they casually call everything under heaven, and they let foreign traders into exactly one port. One. Like the richest mansion on the street cracking the door open just to slide pizza through. Then 1839 hits and the whole thing comes crashing down. Wars, a nationwide addiction problem, one humiliating defeat after another, and neighbours carving up the map like a holiday roast. The mighty giant gets a brutal new nickname, the Sick Man of Asia. It looked like the end. Except a little over a century later, this same broke, battered country claws its way back to become the second largest economy on the planet. How does a total collapse turn into the fastest comeback in human history? That is the entire series, and tonight we light the fuse. But first, smash that like button and tell me down in the comments. What city are you watching from, and what time is it where you are right now? Let's roll. So how does the richest mansion on the street end up broke, battered, and renamed the Sick Man of Asia? It does not happen overnight, and it does not start with armies pouring over the border. It starts with something far smaller and far sneakier. Tidy wooden chests packed with a sticky brown paste, shipped in by the boatload from British-controlled India. The paste was opium, and it was about to do what no foreign general had managed for centuries. The setup was almost comically lopsided, at least at first. European traders desperately wanted what China was making. Tea, silk, porcelain, all the things that made a fashionable London drawing room look expensive. China, on the other hand, wanted almost nothing Europe had to offer. The Qing court took the position that the Celestial Empire already contained everything a civilized person could possibly need, which, when you ran a third of the planet's wealth, was not an entirely unreasonable assumption. The catch was that foreigners had to pay in silver, and silver was draining out of British vaults at an alarming rate. Naturally, somebody eventually had the bright idea to sell the Chinese something they would keep coming back for, no matter the cost. Unfortunately for everyone involved, that something turned out to be a powerful narcotic. By the 1830s, the trade had ballooned into a full-blown public health disaster. Millions of people across the empire were hooked, officials were getting bribed to look the other way, and that precious silver was now flowing out of China instead of in. The emperor, understandably, was not thrilled. He appointed a famously incorruptible official named Lin Zexu to go down to the southern port and shut the whole operation down. Lin took his job seriously, which was rare enough to be noteworthy. He confiscated more than 1,000 tons of opium from foreign merchants and had it destroyed by mixing it with salt and lime and flushing it into the sea, even writing what amounted to a stern open letter to Queen Victoria, asking how she would feel if someone did this to her own people. The letter, for the record, never reached her. The destroyed opium, however, was very much noticed in London, where merchants who had just watched their inventory dissolve into the tide were demanding compensation and, ideally, a war. They got the war. What followed in 1839 was the first of the conflicts that would shatter the empire's confidence, and it was not a fair fight. China had an enormous army on paper and a navy of wooden war junks. Britain showed up with steam-powered iron gunboats that could sail upriver against the current, fire from beyond the range of Chinese cannon, and generally treat the coastline like a shooting gallery. The most famous of these vessels could lob shells into a fort before the defenders could even reach it, which is a polite way of saying the technology gap was less of a gap and more of a canyon. The Qing forces fought hard in places, but courage does not stop a shell, and the result was never really in doubt. The war ended in 1842 with a document that would haunt Chinese politics for the next 100 years. The terms were brutal by any measure. China had to open 5 of its ports to foreign trade rather than the single one it had previously allowed, pay a massive cash indemnity, and hand over the island of Hong Kong to Britain outright. To add a little insult to the injury, foreigners living in China were granted what was called extraterritoriality, meaning that if a British subject committed a crime on Chinese soil, he would be tried under British law by British officials rather than answering to local courts. It was essentially a permanent guest who got to ignore the house rules and could not be evicted. This was the first of what the Chinese would bitterly remember as the unequal treaties, and it set the template. Once one foreign power had carved out its special privileges, the rest lined up for theirs, and the court in Beijing found itself signing away pieces of its own sovereignty on a depressingly regular schedule. The First War, it turned out, had not settled the matter so much as opened the bidding. Within a couple of decades, a second round of fighting broke out over trade disputes and diplomatic insults, and this time a combined British and French force pushed all the way to the capital itself. The most notorious moment came when these troops reached the emperor's magnificent summer gardens on the edge of Beijing, a sprawling complex of palaces, lakes, and priceless treasures that had taken generations to build. The soldiers looted it thoroughly, and then, on the orders of their commanders, burned the whole thing to the ground over several days as a deliberate act of punishment. Many of the treasures carried off in that raid still sit in foreign museums and private collections today, which is a polite way of describing one of the more brazen smash-and-grab operations in recorded history. For the Qing court, watching the imperial pleasure grounds go up in smoke was a humiliation that no indemnity could measure, and it drove home the new and bitter reality that the foreigners could march into the heart of the empire whenever they pleased. If the empire had only had to deal with foreign gunboats, it might have weathered the storm. But weakness at the top tends to crack things open at the bottom, and the bottom of China in this era was a vast sea of impoverished peasants who had every reason to be furious. Into this kindling stepped one of the strangest figures in the entire story, a failed civil service candidate named Hong Xiuquan. After flunking the imperial examinations several times, he suffered a kind of breakdown, had a series of feverish visions, and emerged convinced that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, sent to earth to drive out demons and build a heavenly kingdom on the soil of China. As religious origin stories go, this one was unusually specific. What is genuinely remarkable is not that a man believed this, but that millions of others believed it too. Hong's movement, which came to be called the Taiping, was not a small uprising that got out of hand. It was a parallel state with its own armies, its own capital, its own land laws, and its own iron rules banning things like opium, gambling, and foot binding. At its height, it controlled a huge swath of the most prosperous part of the country, and ruled over tens of millions of people from the city it renamed the Heavenly Capital. For 14 long years, from 1850 onward, the Qing fought a desperate civil war against this rival kingdom, and the cost was almost beyond comprehension. By the time the rebellion was finally crushed, somewhere up to 40 million people had died from the fighting, the famine, and the collapse of normal life that came with it. To put that in perspective, this was one of the deadliest conflicts in all of human history, and it was happening at almost the exact same time as the American Civil War, which most people have heard of and which killed a fraction as many. The Taiping War is the one nobody talks about, and it gutted the empire from the inside while the foreign powers watched from the coast. The dynasty survived, but only barely, and only by leaning on a new generation of regional Chinese commanders who raised their own armies to put down the rebellion. The unintended lesson was that real military power now lived in the provinces rather than the capital, a lesson that would come back to bite the throne later in ways nobody fully appreciated at the time. For now, the empire patched itself up, attempted a few hesitant modernization projects, and tried to convince itself that the worst was behind it. It was not. The next humiliation came from a direction nobody in Beijing took seriously, which made it sting all the more. For most of its history, China had regarded its island neighbour to the east as a junior partner at best, a place that borrowed Chinese writing, Chinese philosophy, and Chinese institutions and sent polite tribute in return. But while China had been busy fending off rebellions and foreign gunboats, Japan had quietly undergone a furious crash course in modernization, building railroads, factories, and crucially a modern navy on the European model. In 1894, the two clashed over influence in Korea, and in 1895 the result arrived like a slap. China's prized modern fleet, the one its reformers had spent enormous sums to build, was sunk almost entirely by the Japanese navy. The student had thrashed the teacher, and the peace treaty was every bit as harsh as the ones the Europeans had forced. China lost territory, paid an enormous indemnity, and had to formally give up its old claims over Korea. For a country that had spent millennia thinking of itself as the natural centre of civilization, being beaten this badly by a former pupil was a psychological wound that arguably hurt worse than the war itself. The defeat by Japan did at least force a serious conversation about reform, though as usual the conversation arrived a little late and ended a little badly. For years, a faction of officials had pushed a cautious program of buying foreign machines, building arsenals and shipyards, and grafting a thin layer of modern technology onto the old system while leaving the underlying culture untouched. The sinking of the modern fleet had just demonstrated rather conclusively the limits of that approach. So in 1898, a group of younger reformers won the ear of the now-grown emperor and launched a breathless burst of change, issuing decree after decree to overhaul the schools, the military, the bureaucracy, and the economy in a matter of weeks. It lasted just over 100 days. The conservatives at court, alarmed at how fast the ground was shifting, turned to the one person who could stop it. Cixi swept back into power in a swift palace coup, placed the reform-minded emperor under what amounted to comfortable house arrest for the rest of his life, and had several of the leading reformers executed while others fled abroad. The lesson many young Chinese drew from this was grim and would prove important later. Peaceful reform from the top kept getting strangled by the very system it tried to fix. The accumulated rage and humiliation finally boiled over into one of the most chaotic episodes of the whole era. In the countryside, secret societies practicing martial arts and folk ritual had been growing, and they channeled all that fury at the obvious targets: foreign missionaries, foreign railroads, foreign churches, and the Chinese converts who had thrown in with them. Westerners nicknamed these fighters the Boxers because of the shadow boxing exercises they practiced, some of which they sincerely believed made them immune to bullets. This belief, it should be said, did not survive contact with actual bullets, but it did inspire a great deal of reckless bravery. Beginning around 1899, the movement swelled, and in a decision that ranks among the worst gambles in the dynasty's long history, the elderly woman who effectively ran the empire decided to back them. That woman was the Empress Dowager Cixi, a figure who had clawed her way from imperial concubine to the most powerful person in China and held that position for decades through a mixture of cunning, ruthlessness, and an excellent grasp of court politics. She had spent years cautiously resisting reform, and now, sensing a chance to expel the hated foreigners for good, she threw the empire's official support behind the uprising and declared war on essentially every major foreign power at once. The Boxers besieged the foreign legations in Beijing, the diplomatic compounds where Western and Japanese officials lived, and for 55 days the world watched a dramatic standoff unfold in the heart of the Chinese capital. The response was the kind of thing that only happens a few times in history. 8 foreign nations, who normally could barely agree on anything and frequently loathed one another, set aside their rivalries just long enough to assemble a joint expedition and march on Beijing. They broke the siege, looted the city with enthusiasm, and the imperial court fled west in disguise, the most powerful woman in Asia reduced to travelling the back roads in a peasant cart. When the dust settled in 1901, China was handed the bill, and what a bill it was. The penalty payment imposed by the so-called Boxer Protocol was staggering, an indemnity to be paid out over decades that, in its annual instalments, came to nearly double what the entire imperial treasury collected in a year. The country was now effectively mortgaged to the very powers it had tried to throw out. It is difficult to sink much lower than declaring war on the world and then agreeing to pay everyone for the privilege of having lost. This catastrophe finally convinced even the stubborn court that something had to change, and so began a frantic, belated round of reforms. The trouble with starting your reforms only after you have hit rock bottom is that the changes you make tend to undermine the very system you're trying to save. The court abolished the ancient civil service examination in 1905, the test that for over 1,000 years had been the single path into the governing class. This was meant to modernize education, and in a sense it did, but it also instantly cut loose a whole class of ambitious young men who'd spent their lives studying for an exam that no longer existed, and who now had to look for a future somewhere other than loyal imperial service. Many of them found that future in new schools, foreign universities, and revolutionary politics, which was not quite the outcome the throne had in mind. At the same time, the court finally got serious about building a genuinely modern army, and here we meet a man whose ambition would shape the next decade. His name was Yuan Shikai, a shrewd and rather heavy-set military organizer who was put in charge of training the new Beiyang army, by far the most modern and effective fighting force in the country. The catch, and it is the same catch from the Taiping years wearing a new uniform, was that this army was loyal to Yuan personally far more than to the dynasty that paid for it. The throne had once again handed enormous military power to a man who might one day decide he had better uses for it than defending a crumbling monarchy. Anyone keeping score could see where this might be heading. In 1908, The two figures who had dominated the court for decades died within a single day of each other, an almost theatrical bit of timing. The young emperor died first, under circumstances that have kept historians arguing ever since, and the indomitable Cixi followed the very next day, but not before installing her chosen successor. That successor was a toddler. Puyi, a boy not yet 3 years old, was placed upon the throne of the largest empire on earth, with predictable results in the carrying out of imperial duties department. A small child cannot govern, regents squabbled, and the dynasty drifted leaderless at the precise moment it most needed a strong hand. The mandate of heaven, as the Chinese called the divine right to rule, was looking distinctly threadbare. The end, when it came, was almost accidental. In October of 1911, in the city of Wuchang, a bomb being assembled by revolutionaries accidentally went off, exposing their plans and forcing them to either rise up immediately or be rounded up and executed. They chose to rise, and to nearly everyone's surprise the mutiny spread like wildfire. Province after province declared its independence from the dynasty, the new modern soldiers in many cases siding with the revolution rather than the throne, and within a matter of weeks the 2,000-year-old institution of imperial rule was visibly collapsing. The revolutionaries needed a leader and a figurehead, and the man they turned to had spent years abroad raising money and organizing against the dynasty. His name was Sun Yat-sen, a doctor by training who had become the most famous revolutionary in the Chinese world, and he hurried home to take up the cause. On the first day of 1912, the Republic of China was proclaimed, with Sun Yat-sen as its provisional president. It was a genuinely world historical moment. For the first time in recorded memory, China had no emperor and was attempting to govern itself as a republic. The problem was that the new republic controlled idealism and prestige, but very little actual military force, while the man who controlled the most powerful army in the country was the ever-calculating Yuan Shikai, who had been called back by the desperate court to save the dynasty. Yuan looked at his options with cold clarity. He could fight for a dying monarchy, or he could broker its surrender and take the top job himself. He chose the second, and a deal was struck. On the 12th of February 1912, the little boy Emperor Puyi formally abdicated, ending not just the Qing dynasty, but the entire imperial system that had governed China since antiquity. Sun Yat-sen, in the interest of national unity, stepped aside, and Yuan Shikai became president of the new republic. The revolutionaries got their republic, and Yuan got the power. It would soon become clear that only one of those two things mattered to him. What followed was a masterclass in how to strangle a young democracy in its cradle. The revolutionary movement had reorganized itself into a proper political party, the Nationalist Party, usually known by its Chinese name as the Kuomintang, and in the country's first real parliamentary elections it did remarkably well. The driving organizational force behind this success was a brilliant young politician named Song Jiaoren, who looked very much like he would become the dominant figure in the new parliament and a serious check on presidential power. In 1913, on a railway platform as he prepared to travel to Beijing, Song was shot and fatally wounded. The trail of evidence pointed uncomfortably close to people around the president, and while the case was never tidily proven in a courtroom, the political message was unmistakable. Yuan then dispensed with the niceties altogether, crushed the Nationalist Party, drove its leaders into exile, dissolved the parliament that annoyed him, and rewrote the rules to concentrate power in his own hands. The Republic was barely a year old, and already its first president was governing as a strongman. Yuan's ambitions, it turned out, did not stop at dictatorship. In a move that suggests he had badly misread the room, he decided that what the country really needed was a new emperor, and that the ideal candidate for the job was himself. He went so far as to have himself declared emperor of a brand new dynasty. The country's reaction was swift and almost unanimous. Provinces revolted, his own generals abandoned him, and the public greeted his coronation with something between fury and ridicule. Having spent his career being underestimated by everyone, Yuan had finally overestimated himself. He was forced to give up the imperial title in disgrace, and in 1916, his health and reputation in ruins, he died. His death removed the one man whose army and authority had been holding the fractured country together, however badly. And here the central tragedy of this whole period reaches its grim conclusion. With no emperor, no functioning parliament, and no strong man left standing, real power devolved to wherever the soldiers and the guns happened to be. The generals who commanded the various pieces of the old Beiyang army, along with regional commanders across the country, simply took control of whatever territory they could hold. China did not become a unified republic. It became a patchwork of private military domains, each ruled by an armed strongman collecting taxes, printing money, and fighting his neighbours. Some of these warlords were genuinely capable administrators who built schools and roads in their territories. Others were little more than bandits with artillery, taxing the same poor harvest several years in advance and conscripting peasants at gunpoint to fill out their ranks. A few were so colourful they almost defy belief, including one general remembered for his fondness for crude poetry and his habit of settling disputes in ways that would not pass a modern human resources review. For the ordinary farmer caught in the middle, the difference between these rulers was mostly academic, since whichever army marched through took the grain regardless of its politics. Trade collapsed across regional borders, currencies multiplied into chaos, and the simple act of travelling between provinces could mean passing through a dozen different tax checkpoints run by a dozen different armies. The empire was gone, the republic was a name on paper, and the country had fragmented into the rule of the generals. From the fall of the gunboats to the fall of the throne, the great civilization had been hollowed out, and now it was being pulled apart. And yet, in the middle of all this wreckage, something else was stirring, something that would not be measured in armies or territory, but in ideas. Because while the politicians and the generals were busy tearing the country to pieces, a generation of young thinkers had looked at the smoking ruins of the old order and asked a far more dangerous question than who should hold power. They asked what kind of country China should even be. The thinking went something like this. China had tried everything. It had tried clinging to tradition, and that got it carved up by foreign navies. It had tried importing a few foreign machines while keeping the old culture intact, and that got its modern fleets sunk by Japan. It had finally tried becoming a republic, and that had collapsed into warlordism almost immediately. To a generation of furious, brilliant young people, the conclusion was obvious and shattering. The problem was not just the dynasty or the constitution. The problem went all the way down to the culture itself, to the values and the writing and the family structures that had defined Chinese life for thousands of years. If the country was going to survive, they argued, it would have to remake itself from the foundations up. The movement that grew out of this conviction came to be known as the New Culture Movement, and its unofficial headquarters was the country's most prestigious university, in Beijing, which under a famously open-minded chancellor had become a magnet for radical professors and restless students. The man who lit the fuse was an intense combative scholar named Chen Duxiu, who in 1915 founded a magazine that would become the Bible of the new generation. The magazine was called New Youth, and its message was as blunt as its title. The old ways, Chen argued, were dragging China to its grave. Confucianism, the ethical and social system that had organized Chinese life for over 2,000 years, with its emphasis on hierarchy, obedience to elders, and rigid social roles, was recast not as venerable wisdom, but as a cage. To young readers desperate for a way out of national humiliation, this was electrifying stuff. The movement organized its hopes around two figures it presented almost as visiting dignitaries. They called them Mr. Democracy and Mr. Science, and the idea was charmingly direct. If China would only welcome these two gentlemen, embracing self-government on one hand and rational evidence-based inquiry on the other, it could shake off centuries of superstition and despotism and join the modern world. Naturally, this also meant rethinking everything that stood in their way, including the deeply entrenched subordination of women. The movement championed women's education, attacked arranged marriages, and questioned the whole structure of the traditional family. For a society where these things had been treated as the unchangeable order of nature, this was less a debate than an earthquake. One of the most consequential battles the reformers picked was over something that sounds dry, but was in fact revolutionary: the written language itself. For millennia, serious Chinese writing had been done in classical literary form, an elegant, compressed, and frankly difficult style that bore little resemblance to how anyone actually spoke. The practical effect was that literacy was locked behind years of specialized study, which conveniently kept it the property of a small educated elite. A young scholar named Hu Shi led the charge to change this, championing the use of the everyday spoken language, known as vernacular, for literature, journalism, and education. The argument was simple and powerful. If you want to educate a nation of hundreds of millions, you cannot ask them all to master a language that takes a lifetime to learn. Write the way people talk. It is hard to overstate how much this single shift would eventually do to spread literacy, but at the time it was fiercely controversial, treated by traditionalists as a kind of vandalism against a sacred inheritance. The proof of the idea came not from arguments, but from stories. A handful of writers began producing fiction in the plain-spoken language, tackling subjects that classical literature would never have stooped to, and the effect on readers was immediate. One particularly influential author wrote piercing short stories about ordinary people crushed by tradition, superstition, and poverty, using simple, direct prose that anyone could follow. These were not polite court tales about scholars and emperors. They were unflinching portraits of village life, and they hit a generation of young readers like a thunderclap, showing them that the new language could carry not just information, but real emotional power. Within a remarkably short span, the everyday tongue went from a thing serious writers looked down on to the standard medium of modern Chinese literature, which is the kind of victory that reshapes a culture quietly and permanently. For a few years, the dominant mood among these young reformers was a hopeful, idealistic faith that the answers lay in the liberal West, in its democracy, its science, its individualism. Then came the betrayal that shattered that faith almost overnight, and it arrived from the one place they had trusted to be fair. The First World War had just ended, and China had actually joined the winning side, sending tens of thousands of labourers to support the Allied war effort, with a reasonable expectation of being treated as a partner at the peace table. In particular, the Chinese delegation expected that the territory on the eastern coast that had been controlled by Germany would be returned to China now that Germany had lost. Instead, in 1919, word reached home that the peace conference at Versailles had quietly handed those German-held holdings not back to China, but over to Japan. The country had fought on the winning side and was being looted by its own allies as a reward. The reaction was instant and historic. On the 4th of May 1919, around 3,000 students poured out of the universities and gathered in front of the Great Gate in the heart of Beijing, furious at both the foreign powers who had carved up their country and the weak government that had let it happen. What began as a student protest exploded into a nationwide movement, spreading to merchants who shut their shops in solidarity and workers who went on strike. The anger that day was not only aimed at distant diplomats. The crowds turned on the Chinese officials they blamed for cozying up to Japan and selling out the nation's interests, and the demonstrations spilled over into direct confrontation, with one minister's residence set upon by the furious students. Arrests followed, which only poured fuel on the fire, as cities across the country erupted in sympathy, and the government found that locking up students was a remarkably effective way to create more of them. It was, in many ways, the moment a generation of intellectual debate turned into a mass political force, and it gave the whole era its name. The energy of that day would echo through everything that followed. But the protests also marked a turning point in what these young reformers believed. The faith in the liberal West had been the casualty of Versailles, and now a powerful new idea was arriving from a different direction entirely. 2 years earlier, in 1917, a revolution in Russia had overthrown that country's old empire and promised to build a society run by and for the workers, explicitly opposed to the imperialism that the Chinese had just experienced so painfully at Versailles. To young Chinese radicals who had just watched the democracies of the world betray them, this was an intoxicating alternative. Here was a philosophy that named foreign domination as the enemy, promised a scientific path to a just society, and had apparently just been proven to work in a vast neighbouring empire that looked a lot like their own. Mr. Democracy and Mr. Science had, for some, acquired a new and far more radical companion. They did not pursue this new idea entirely on their own. The new revolutionary government in Russia had created an organisation devoted to spreading communist revolution worldwide, and it sent agents to make contact with the most promising radical circles in China, offering guidance, organisation, and a clear model to follow. With this encouragement, the scattered study groups that had been quietly devouring this new philosophy in cities across the country began to coordinate, and the idea took hold that what they needed was a proper organised party of their own. And so, in July of 1921, in the foreign-controlled district of Shanghai where the warlord government's police held little sway, a tiny gathering took place that almost nobody noticed at the time. A grand total of 13 delegates assembled, representing a movement that counted perhaps 50 members in the entire country. This was the founding Congress of the Chinese Communist Party. It was about as humble a beginning as a world-changing organisation has ever had. The meeting was so secretive and so small that when suspicious agents nearly stumbled onto it, the delegates simply packed up and relocated the whole Congress onto a rented pleasure boat floating on a quiet lake outside the city, finishing their historic deliberations while pretending to be tourists out for a relaxing day on the water. As cover stories go, it was at least more pleasant than most. Among the founding figures were men who would loom enormous over the century to come. There was the influential thinker Li Dazhao, one of the first prominent intellectuals to champion the Russian model, and there was a young, ambitious delegate from the countryside named Mao Zedong, at this point an unknown library assistant and organizer whose name meant nothing to anyone outside a small circle. The party's first general secretary, its initial leader, was Chen Duxiu, the very man who had founded New Youth and helped launch the whole intellectual revolution in the first place. From the man who started a magazine to the man who would one day stand atop the country, the thread ran straight through that little boat on the lake. It is genuinely difficult to look at this scene without a sense of the absurd. 13 men, 50 members, a borrowed boat, and a movement that any of the warlords carving up the country could have crushed with a single company of soldiers. Nobody who mattered took them seriously, and there was no obvious reason anyone should have. And yet, from this handful of idealists meeting in secret because they were too few and too weak to meet in the open, a force was being born that would, in just 28 years, take control of the entire country. The empire had fallen, the republic had splintered, and out of the wreckage, two very different visions of China's future were beginning to take shape. The struggle between them and the men who would lead it is where the story turns next. Both of those visions had the same inconvenient problem when they started out. To take over a country, you first need a country, and in the early 1920s, China was less a nation than a collection of armed estates, each run by a general who answered to no one above him. The men with the guns had the real power, and there were a great many guns. Across the fractured map, somewhere around 1.5 million soldiers stood under arms, divided among rival factions that fought, bargained and betrayed one another with the regularity of a soap opera, just with considerably more artillery. The biggest of these factions controlled the north and the all-important capital, and they came in 3 main flavours. There was the clique that held the heartland around the capital, led by a stern, scholarly commander named Wu Peifu, a man so fond of classical learning that admirers called him the Scholar General, which is a rare reputation in a profession not known for its book clubs. There was a rival northern clique, and there was the powerful faction out in the northeast, the old Manchurian homeland run by a former bandit turned warlord named Zhang Zuolin. Zhang had come up the hard way, rising from the world of mounted outlaws to command an entire region with its own arsenal and railways, and he was nobody's fool. Further south, a commander named Sun Chuanfang held a cluster of the wealthy eastern provinces. These men shifted alliances constantly, ganging up on whoever was winning and then turning on each other the moment the threat passed, which made the politics of the period genuinely difficult to follow, even for the people living through it. For the ordinary population, all this manoeuvring meant years of misery. Armies marched back and forth across the same farmland, requisitioning food, conscripting young men, and printing whatever currency suited them that week. The dream of a modern, unified republic looked further away than ever, and it was precisely this hopeless deadlock that gave Sun Yat-sen, the famous revolutionary who had briefly been the first president before stepping aside, one last opening. Exiled from the chaos of the north, he set up a rival government in the far south, in the bustling port city that served as his power base, and from there he plotted to do something nobody had managed since the fall of the empire: reunite the entire country by force. The trouble was that Sun had prestige but very little muscle. His movement, the Nationalist Party, had idealism, a flag, and a founding philosophy, but it did not have the kind of disciplined modern army you need to defeat a dozen entrenched warlords. He went looking for allies who could help him build one, and he found a willing partner in an unexpected place. The Western democracies, still busy treating China as something to be carved up rather than helped, had no interest in funding his revolution. The new revolutionary government in Russia, on the other hand, was extremely interested. They offered money, weapons, military advisors, and organizational expertise, all of it aimed at building Sun a real army and a real party machine modelled on their own. This Soviet help came with a condition that would shape everything that followed. The Russians also backed the tiny Communist Party that, as we saw, had been born just a couple of years earlier in a borrowed boat, and they wanted these two groups to work together. And so in 1923 the Nationalists and the Communists formed what became known as the First United Front, an alliance in which Communist members actually joined the Nationalist Party as individuals while keeping their own separate organisation intact. It was, to put it mildly, an awkward marriage. The two partners had wildly different visions of China's future and trusted each other about as far as they could throw a gunboat, but for the moment they shared an enemy in the warlords, and a shared enemy can paper over a remarkable number of differences, at least for a while. The Russians did not just send a check and wish everyone luck. They dispatched seasoned advisors who embedded themselves at the highest levels of the southern government, reorganising the Nationalist Party along the tight, disciplined lines of their own ruling party, complete with party cells, propaganda departments, and the principle that the organisation should run the army rather than the other way around. A senior political advisor became one of the most influential foreigners in the southern capital, while military experts overhauled the training and command structure of the fledgling revolutionary forces. For a movement that had spent years as a loose collection of idealists and exiles, this was a crash course in how to build a machine capable of actually taking power, and the irony is that both the Nationalists and the Communists would carry these organisational habits with them for the rest of the century, long after they had become mortal enemies. The centrepiece of this new partnership was a military academy, established on an island near Sun's southern capital, designed to train a new officer corps that would be loyal to the cause rather than to any regional strongman. This school would produce the commanders of the Revolutionary Army, and its young graduates would go on to fight on both sides of the conflicts to come, which gives you a sense of just how tangled this period gets. The man chosen to run the academy was a tough, ambitious, and intensely disciplined officer who had trained in Japan and visited Russia to study its military methods. His name was Chiang Kai-shek, and at this stage he was a rising figure rather than a household name, the kind of capable subordinate that powerful movements rely on. That was about to change in a hurry. In March of 1925, Sun Yat-sen died of cancer at the age of 58, leaving the nationalist movement without the one figure whose personal authority had held its quarrelsome factions together. His death set off exactly the kind of succession struggle you would expect, and out of that struggle the commander of the military academy steadily outmaneuvered his rivals. Controlling the army, it turns out, is a tremendous advantage in any contest over who gets to lead, a lesson that recurs throughout this entire story with almost monotonous reliability. Within a year or so, Chiang Kai-shek had positioned himself as the dominant military and political leader of the nationalist cause, and he was ready to attempt the great gamble that Sun had only dreamed of. That gamble was the Northern Expedition, launched in 1926, a military campaign to march north from the southern base, smash the warlord cliques one by one, and reunite the country under nationalist rule. On paper, it looked wildly ambitious. Chiang set out with an army of roughly 100,000 against opponents who collectively commanded many times that number. But the campaign had two secret weapons that the raw figures did not capture. The first was genuine popular enthusiasm. For millions of ordinary people exhausted by warlord rule, the advancing revolutionary army represented hope, and communist organisers went ahead of the troops, stirring up support among workers and peasants. The second was the simple fact that warlord armies were often held together by money and self-interest rather than loyalty, which meant that when the revolutionary forces started winning, entire enemy units would change sides rather than die for a losing cause. Through this combination of fighting and mass defection, Chiang's army snowballed as it advanced, swelling from that initial 100,000 to something like 700,000 men. It is a great deal easier to conquer a country when half the opposing soldiers decide they would rather join you than shoot at you. By early 1927, the expedition had swept through the south and centre and was closing on the great prize of the lower river region, including the largest and richest city in the country, the international commercial hub on the eastern coast. And it was here, at the moment of his greatest triumph, that Chiang Kai-shek made the move that would define the rest of his career and tear the United Front to pieces. He had never trusted his communist allies, and now that they had helped him win, he no longer needed them. Worse, from his point of view, the communists and the labour unions they organised had grown dangerously powerful in exactly the wealthy urban areas he most wanted to control, and the conservative businessmen and bankers whose money he needed were terrified of them. So Chiang struck first. In April of 1927, he turned on his allies in a sudden coordinated purge. In the great commercial city, The violence was carried out in large part by a notorious criminal organization, a powerful underworld syndicate led by a shadowy crime boss who controlled the city's rackets and was happy to do the dirty work in exchange for influence and protection. It was a chillingly modern arrangement, a political leader outsourcing his crackdown to organized crime. Over a span of days, communists, union leaders, and suspected sympathizers were rounded up and killed, with the death toll running to many thousands. The first united front, that awkward marriage of convenience, was over, drowned in a single brutal stroke. The communists who survived scattered, and the alliance gave way to open hostility that would burn for the next 2 decades. The communists did not simply accept their near destruction. They struck back with a series of armed uprisings, attempting to seize cities and rally support, but they were outmatched and poorly coordinated, and each revolt was crushed in turn. One ambitious delegate from the founding of the party, the country boy named Mao Zedong, led an uprising in the rural south built around peasants and miners. It failed like the others, but Mao drew a conclusion from the wreckage that would prove enormously important. Rather than retreating into exile or trying again to seize the cities where the enemy was strongest, he led his battered survivors up into a remote mountain base in the countryside, far from the reach of Chiang's armies, and began rethinking the entire revolutionary strategy from the ground up. While his comrades clung to the orthodox idea that revolution had to be made by urban workers, Mao started betting on the vast, neglected ocean of poor peasants instead. It was an unfashionable idea at the time, and it would eventually change the course of the century. Meanwhile, Chiang pressed on to finish what the expedition had started. The northern warlords, weakened and divided, could not hold. The old Manchurian strongman Zhang Zuolin, who had taken the capital, was forced to retreat back toward his northeastern stronghold by rail in 1928, and this is where one of the era's most consequential assassinations took place. The Japanese, who had long treated Zhang's northeastern territory as their personal sphere of influence, had grown frustrated with him for not being obedient enough to their interests. Officers in the Japanese army stationed in the region decided to solve the problem permanently and planted a bomb on the railway. As Zhang's train passed beneath it, the charge detonated, killing the old warlord. The plot was meant to throw the region into chaos that Japan could exploit, a scheme that reveals just how brazenly the Japanese military was already operating on Chinese soil, and it offers an early preview of the catastrophe that was coming. The plan backfired in the short term. Zhang's son, a dashing and somewhat unpredictable young commander remembered as the young marshal, inherited his father's army and his fury at the Japanese, and rather than fragmenting his domain, he chose to throw in his lot with Chiang and the nationalists. With that pledge of allegiance, the last major piece fell into place. In June of 1928, nationalist forces entered the old imperial capital, and Chiang Kai-shek could finally declare what no one had achieved since the empire fell: a reunified China under a single government. After more than a decade of fragmentation, the country was, at least on paper, whole again. On paper being the crucial phrase, because the unity Chiang had stitched together was a great deal flimsier than the triumphant ceremonies suggested. He had not so much conquered the warlords as persuaded many of them to nominally accept his authority, while keeping their own armies and running their own territories more or less as before. It was less a unified nation than a coalition held together with optimism and the threat of force, and the threat of force only works if everyone believes you will follow through. Within a year, several of his most powerful supposed allies decided they did not believe it, and the result was an enormous, bloody falling out that historians remember as one of the largest civil conflicts of the era. Roughly 1 million soldiers were thrown into a war among the very generals who had just unified the country, a sprawling struggle across the central plains that Chiang ultimately won, but at staggering cost in lives and ruined countryside. The lesson was clear enough. The new government in its capital on the river genuinely controlled only a portion of the wealthy east, while vast stretches of the country remained in the hands of regional strongmen who tolerated Chiang exactly as long as it suited them. Still, the decade that followed this shaky reunification has a real claim to being the closest thing to normalcy China had known in a long time, and the government made the most of it. This was the period when the nationalists tried with mixed success to build a modern state. There was a genuine push toward modernization, with new roads, railways, banks, and industries appearing in the areas the government actually controlled. Foreign investment flowed into the coastal cities, which sprouted department stores, cinemas, and the trappings of a modern consumer society, that would have astonished anyone from the previous century. The legal status of women improved on paper, with new laws challenging old customs and educated urban women in the big cities. Enjoyed freedoms their grandmothers could not have imagined, though it is worth remembering that this glittering modern life touched only a thin slice of the population. The government also made a serious attempt to drag the country's finances into the modern world, which was no small task in a place where dozens of warlord currencies and a patchwork of foreign banks had turned simple commerce into a daily exercise in arithmetic. The nationalists worked to establish a unified national currency and a proper central banking system, measures that, where they took hold, made trade smoother and gave the state a real financial backbone for the first time. Tariff revenues that had long been controlled by foreign powers were gradually clawed back, giving the government a steadier income. None of this was glamorous, and none of it made for stirring speeches, but a country that cannot collect taxes or print a trusted banknote cannot do much of anything, and for a few years it genuinely looked as though the foundations of a modern economy were being laid. The government also launched an earnest and slightly peculiar campaign to reform the everyday behaviour of its citizens, spearheaded by Chiang's formidable wife, a brilliant American-educated woman from one of the most influential families in the country. This crusade aimed to instill discipline, hygiene, and proper moral conduct in the population, promoting virtues like punctuality, cleanliness, and good manners through an avalanche of slogans and public guidelines. There were rules about everything from not spitting in the street to buttoning your clothes correctly, the sort of top-down etiquette campaign that sounds reasonable in theory and tends to feel a little much in practice. Whether lecturing a starving farmer about the importance of brushing his teeth was the most pressing national priority is a question the planners did not dwell on. Because here was the uncomfortable truth lurking beneath the modern shop windows and the etiquette pamphlets. The vast majority of the country, something like 85% of the population, were peasants living in deep poverty, scratching out a precarious existence in the countryside that the modernising government in the cities barely reached. The glamour of the coastal metropolis and the misery of the rural interior were two different worlds occupying the same map, and the fragility of that rural existence was driven home with horrifying force in 1931, when the great river system that runs through the heart of the country overflowed in one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded human history. Catastrophic flooding submerged an area of farmland and homes almost beyond imagining, and the death toll from drowning, disease, and the famine that followed has been estimated anywhere from 1 million to as many as 4 million people. It was a stark reminder that for most of China, survival still hung on the weather, and the modern state was nowhere to be found when the waters rose. As if a natural catastrophe of that scale were not enough, that same fateful year brought the disaster that would ultimately doom the entire nationalist project and drag the country into all-out war. It came once again from Japan, and once again it began with a manufactured excuse. In September of 1931, Japanese officers in the northeast, the same army that had assassinated the old warlord, staged a small explosion on a stretch of railway line they themselves controlled, then blamed it on Chinese saboteurs. It was a flimsy pretext, transparent enough that few outsiders were fooled, but it gave the Japanese army the excuse it wanted. Using the staged incident as justification, Japanese forces launched a full invasion of the entire northeastern region, and within roughly 3 months they had seized the whole of it, an area larger than many European countries. To govern their conquest while pretending it was something other than naked aggression, the Japanese set up a puppet state, a supposedly independent nation that was in reality entirely controlled by Tokyo. And to lend it a veneer of legitimacy, they reached back into history for a figurehead, dredging up the very last emperor of the fallen dynasty, the man who as a toddler had occupied the throne and then been forced to abdicate as a child. Now an adult, he was installed as the nominal ruler of the new puppet state, a hollow monarch presiding over a country that took all its real orders from a foreign army. It was a strange and rather sad coda for the last emperor, reduced to a ceremonial mascot for the occupation of his ancestral homeland. Faced with this brazen seizure of a huge chunk of his country, you might expect that Chiang Kai-shek would have thrown everything he had at the invaders. He did almost the opposite, and his reasoning would become one of the most controversial decisions of the whole period. Chiang calculated that his young, fragile, half-unified state was in no condition to win a war against the modern, industrialized Japanese military, and that a premature fight would simply destroy him. More than that, he was convinced that the deadlier long-term threat to his vision of China was not the foreign invader on the border, but the domestic enemy growing in the countryside, the communists. He adopted a policy that can be summed up as putting his own house in order before facing the threat from outside, which in practice meant tolerating the Japanese occupation of the Northeast for the time being while pouring his military strength into hunting down and destroying the communist movement. To a great many patriotic Chinese watching their country dismembered while the army went off to fight other Chinese, this looked less like strategy and more like betrayal, and that anger would eventually come back to bite him in a spectacular way. For now, though, Chiang threw himself into the campaign against the communists with grim determination. While he had been busy unifying the country and modernizing the cities, the communists, led increasingly by the mountain strategist who had bet everything on the peasantry, had been quietly building something remarkable in the rural south. They established a self-governing territory deep in the countryside, a kind of state within a state, where they carried out land redistribution, organized the peasants, and built up their own army using the guerrilla tactics that Mao had been refining. At its height, this rural base controlled a population running into the millions, and it represented exactly the kind of alternative China that Chiang was determined to wipe out. The fighting doctrine the communists developed here was as important as the territory itself, and it was elegantly suited to an army that was always outnumbered and outgunned. The basic idea, boiled down to its essentials, was to refuse the kind of stand-up battle a weaker force is bound to lose, and instead to retreat when the enemy advanced, harass him when he halted, strike when he grew tired, and pursue when he withdrew. Wrapped in this approach was a deeper insight that the conventional commanders of the day badly underestimated, the conviction that the support of the local population was a weapon more valuable than any artillery piece. A guerrilla army that the peasants would feed, hide, and warn of approaching danger could melt into the countryside and reappear at will, turning the very vastness and poverty of rural China into an asset. Chiang's modern divisions, trained to seize cities and win pitched battles, kept lunging at an enemy that simply dissolved in front of them, which is a deeply frustrating way to fight a war. He went after it again and again. The Nationalist Army launched a series of military operations designed to surround and crush the communist base, and the first several attempts failed, foiled by the communists' superior knowledge of the terrain and their hit-and-run tactics that turned the countryside into a trap. But Chiang learned from his failures. For the decisive campaign in the early 1930s, he assembled an enormous force, something approaching 1 million soldiers, and adopted a patient, methodical strategy of strangulation, building rings of fortified blockhouses and tightening the noose slowly rather than charging in. Advised by foreign military experts, this approach steadily squeezed the communist territory, cutting off its supplies and shrinking its space until the rural republic was on the verge of total annihilation. By 1934, the communists faced a simple, grim choice: stay and be destroyed, or break out and run. They chose to run, and what followed became the founding legend of the communist movement, an episode of almost mythic proportions known as the Long March. Surrounded and outnumbered, the main communist forces smashed through the encircling lines and set off on an epic, desperate retreat across some of the harshest terrain in Asia. Over the course of roughly a year, they trekked something like 6,000 miles, crossing freezing mountain ranges, treacherous swamps, and rushing rivers, harried constantly by enemy forces and hostile warlords, suffering terribly from hunger, cold, exhaustion, and disease. The numbers tell the brutal story better than any description. Of the tens of thousands who set out on the march, fewer than 1 in 10 reached the journey's end, a windswept and remote region in the country's northwest where the shattered survivors finally regrouped and established a new base. The journey produced episodes that would become sacred to the movement. There was the desperate crossing of a fast, freezing river over a half-destroyed iron chain bridge, with soldiers reportedly inching across the bare chains under fire, an exploit so dramatic that it became a centerpiece of communist legend, polished and embellished in the retelling until it shone. There were the high snow mountains where men in summer rags froze to death by the hundreds, and worst of all there were the vast, trackless, high-altitude grasslands, a deceptively peaceful sea of marsh and bog where the unwary sank without a trace, and where there was almost nothing to eat. Soldiers boiled their leather belts and dug for roots to survive that stretch, and many simply lay down and did not get up. Whether every heroic detail happened exactly as later accounts claimed is something historians still argue about, but the core of the ordeal was real enough, and the suffering was not exaggerated. By any conventional military measure, the Long March was a catastrophic defeat, a near-total loss of the army and the territory the Communists had spent years building. And yet it accomplished two things that would prove decisive. First, the sheer drama of the survival turned a beaten remnant into a legend, a story of endurance and willpower that would be told and retold to inspire generations of recruits, transforming a military disaster into a powerful myth of destiny. Second, and more concretely, it was during this terrible journey that the country boy who had bet on the peasants finally consolidated his control over the party. Amid the chaos and the recriminations of the retreat, at a crucial meeting along the way, his rivals were discredited and his strategic vision was vindicated, and Mao Zedong emerged as the undisputed leader of the communist movement. The man who had been an unknown delegate at that boat meeting was now the figure around whom the whole future of the party would revolve. So as the mid-1930s arrived, the board was set for a final showdown between the two great rivals, the nationalists in their river capital and the communists in their northwestern refuge. Chiang, smelling blood, prepared to finish the job and wipe out the survivors of the Long March once and for all. And here history took one of its sharpest and most unexpected turns, delivered by the very man whose loyalty had helped Chiang unify the country in the first place. The dashing young marshal, son of the assassinated northern warlord, had lost his homeland to the Japanese occupation and burned with a desire to fight the invaders rather than waste his troops chasing fellow Chinese through the hills. He, and many of his soldiers, found Chiang's policy of attacking the communists while ignoring Japan increasingly intolerable. In December of 1936, Chiang travelled to a historic northwestern city to personally pressure his reluctant commanders into renewing the offensive against the communist base. Instead, the young marshal and his allies did something almost unthinkable. They mutinied and took their own supreme leader prisoner, holding him captive and refusing to release him until he agreed to call off the civil war and unite the country against Japan. It was an extraordinary gamble, a kidnapping of the head of state by his own subordinate, and for a tense couple of weeks the entire future of the country hung in the balance, with hardliners on the communist side reportedly wanting to see Chiang executed for the years of bloodshed he had inflicted on them. What happened next surprised everyone, and it was the communists who blinked first, for reasons of cold calculation. A senior and famously skilled communist negotiator, a smooth and brilliant diplomat who would remain a central figure in Chinese politics for decades, travelled to the scene to broker a deal. The communists, it turned out, had concluded that they were far more useful to themselves with Chiang alive and leading a united resistance against Japan than dead, which might have simply thrown the country back into leaderless chaos that the invaders could exploit. Through tense negotiation, with this communist mediator playing a central role, Chiang was pressured into a stunning reversal of his entire strategy. He agreed to suspend the war against the communists and join them in a second united front, a renewed alliance of the two bitter enemies, this time aimed squarely at resisting the Japanese. It was, in its way, history rhyming with itself, the two rivals once again forced into an uneasy partnership against a common foe, just as they had been a decade earlier before Chiang turned on his allies in the great commercial city. Nobody involved trusted anybody else, and both sides fully intended to resume their struggle the moment the foreign threat was dealt with. But for the moment, the civil war was frozen, and a fractured, exhausted China turned to face the storm gathering on its eastern flank. The man who had forced this dramatic reversal paid a steep and rather astonishing price for it. Having pulled off the kidnapping that changed the country's course, the young marshal then made the strange decision to personally escort his freed captive back to the capital as a gesture of respect and submission, apparently believing that his patriotic motives would be understood and forgiven. They were not. Chiang, unsurprisingly, was not the forgiving type when it came to people who had held him at gunpoint, and the moment they arrived, the young marshal was placed under arrest. He would spend not weeks or years, but decades under house arrest, held captive in one form or another for more than half a century, long outliving most of the figures in this story. It stands as one of history's more remarkable examples of a man who won the argument and lost his freedom for it. The years of warlords and purges and desperate marches had, almost by accident, produced a country just barely united enough to fight for its survival. Because the gathering storm was about to break, and the war that followed would be one of the most devastating that any nation has ever endured. The storm broke on a warm night in July of 1937, And like so many disasters in this story, it began with something small. At an ancient stone bridge near the old northern capital, a bridge named long ago for the famous European traveller who had once marvelled at the wealth of China, Japanese troops stationed in the area were conducting night manoeuvres when one of their soldiers briefly went missing. He turned up again shortly afterward, having apparently just wandered off, but by then the Japanese had used his absence to demand entry into a nearby walled town. Shots were exchanged, and a minor incident spiralled with terrifying speed into the full-scale war that both sides had been bracing for. A misplaced soldier and a tense standoff at a bridge were enough to ignite 8 years of carnage, which tells you just how flammable the situation between the two countries had already become. This time there would be no localized clash and no negotiated pause. The Japanese committed to outright conquest, and their modern, battle-hardened army moved with brutal efficiency. Within roughly 6 weeks they had seized the old northern capital and its surrounding region, and the fragile unity that the kidnapping crisis had forced upon China the previous winter was now to be tested in the harshest way imaginable. The nationalists and communists were, in theory, allies again against the common enemy, though as we have seen, the word ally carried an unusual amount of suspicion in this particular partnership. Chiang Kai-shek made a fateful decision about where to make his stand. Rather than continue ceding the north, he chose to open a second front far to the south, at the great commercial metropolis on the eastern coast, the richest and most international city in the country, and the symbolic heart of his modernized China. His reasoning had a certain logic. Fighting in the open plains of the north played to Japanese strengths in tanks and mobility, whereas drawing them into a grinding battle for a huge city, and doing it in full view of the foreign powers whose citizens and investments filled that city, might buy sympathy, support, and time. So in August of 1937, he threw his best German-trained divisions into the defence of the metropolis, and what followed was a battle of staggering scale, drawing in something approaching 1 million combatants on both sides over 3 savage months. The fighting was a meat grinder of a kind that foreshadowed the worst urban combat of the century, street by street, building by building, with both sides pouring in reinforcements only to see them consumed. One episode from that battle became an instant legend, and offers a window into the desperate courage on display. As the Chinese army withdrew across the river, a small detachment of soldiers was ordered to stay behind and hold a single, fortified warehouse on the bank, in full view of the foreign districts across the water, essentially to put on a show of defiance for the watching world. Vastly outnumbered, this group held the building against repeated assaults for days, their stand witnessed by crowds and foreign journalists from across the river as if it were grim theatre. The exact size of the unit was deliberately exaggerated in the press to inflate its heroism, which was good propaganda even if the arithmetic was creative, and their defence became a celebrated symbol of resistance. It was a small bright spot in what was, overall, a catastrophic and costly defeat. The city fell, and Chiang's irreplaceable elite troops had been gutted in the process. What came after the fall of the metropolis is one of the darkest chapters in the history of modern warfare, and it must be approached with sobriety rather than any attempt at lightness. As the Japanese army advanced on the nationalist capital upriver and captured it in December of 1937, it unleashed weeks of mass atrocity against the city's surrendered soldiers and helpless civilian population. Tens of thousands of prisoners and unarmed residents were murdered, and the scale of the killing was so vast that estimates of the death toll range enormously, from tens of thousands to as many as 300,000, a span that itself testifies to the chaos and horror of those weeks. The suffering inflicted on the civilian population, and on women in particular, was systematic and appalling. There is nothing in this episode to soften, and no observation to lighten it, so we will simply record that it happened, that it was among the worst war crimes of the era, and that its memory remains a raw wound in the region to this day. Amid the horror, there were a handful of foreigners who refused to flee and instead organised a protected area in the city, a safety zone where they sheltered as many civilians as they could cram in, very likely saving hundreds of thousands of lives. The man who led this effort was, in one of history's stranger ironies, a German businessman and member of the Nazi Party, who used his country's alliance with Japan as leverage to shield the people under his protection. That a member of one of the 20th century's most notorious movements should end up remembered as a humanitarian rescuer is the kind of moral knot that history occasionally ties and declines to untangle. The The Japanese campaign of conquest also relied on weapons and methods that placed it among the most brutal of the war. Japanese forces made use of chemical agents in their attacks, and a secret branch of their army conducted horrific biological warfare experiments on captured prisoners, work so monstrous that it is difficult to discuss in any detail. The occupation also established a vast and coercive system of sexual slavery, forcing enormous numbers of women across the conquered territories into military brothels under conditions of unspeakable cruelty. These are not subjects that admit of any humour, and they will simply stand here as part of the record of what the war truly cost the people who endured it. Faced with an enemy this relentless, the nationalist government resorted to increasingly desperate measures to slow the advance, and one of these decisions ranks among the most tragic acts of self-inflicted harm in the entire war. In June of 1938, in an attempt to halt the Japanese drive by turning nature into a weapon, Chiang's forces deliberately breached the Great Dykes holding back the country's most temperamental and dangerous river, the one whose floods had killed so many in the past. The resulting deluge did slow the Japanese advance, but it also drowned and displaced the Chinese countryside on an enormous scale, killing something on the order of 500,000 of their own people and rendering millions homeless. And the bitter punchline, if such a word can even be used here, is that it did not work for long. The Japanese regrouped, found other routes, and pressed on to capture the major inland industrial city that the government had been trying to protect. A staggering human sacrifice had brought only a brief delay. With the loss of the great inland city, the war settled into a long grinding stalemate that would define the next several years. The Japanese controlled the coast, the major cities, the railways, and the wealthiest regions, but they could not conquer the vast interior, and the Chinese could not push them out. The nationalist government retreated deep into the mountainous southwest, establishing a wartime capital in a fog-shrouded city far up the river, a place chosen largely because its perpetual mist and surrounding gorges made it difficult to bomb, though the Japanese tried with grim persistence anyway. From this remote refuge, Chiang's government held on, hunkered down, waiting and hoping that the wider world would eventually be dragged into the fight on its side. For years, that hope went unanswered. China fought Japan largely alone, a fact that is often forgotten in the West, where the war in Asia tends to be remembered as something that began later. The occupiers, for their part, understood that they could not garrison every village in a country this enormous, so they did what conquerors throughout history have done and looked for locals willing to govern on their behalf. They found a willing partner in a senior nationalist figure who had once been a celebrated revolutionary and a close associate of the movement's founder, but who had come to believe that resistance was hopeless and that the only realistic path was to make a deal with Japan. He broke with Chiang and set up a rival collaborationist government in the captured eastern capital, complete with its own flag, ministries and army, all of it taking its real orders from Tokyo. It was, in effect, another puppet regime to sit alongside the one already running the conquered northeast, and it gave the occupation a thin coat of Chinese paint. History has not been kind to its leader, whose name became a byword for treachery in his own country, which is roughly the legacy you sign up for when you agree to administer your homeland on behalf of the army invading it. Behind the lines of this occupied territory, however, the Japanese never enjoyed the quiet they wanted. The communist forces, rather than confronting the enemy in great pitched battles they were sure to lose, spread out through the countryside of the occupied zones, building shadow administrations, ambushing supply columns, and tying down enormous numbers of Japanese troops who might otherwise have been used against the nationalist front. At one point they mounted a large coordinated offensive against the occupiers' railways and strongpoints, a rare show of force that did real damage. The Japanese response was a savage campaign of collective punishment against the rural population suspected of sheltering the guerrillas, a brutal scorched earth policy intended to drain the sea in which the fighters swam. It failed to break the resistance and instead deepened the hatred of the occupiers, while the communists quietly emerged from the war years far stronger and more deeply rooted in the countryside than they had been when it started. That changed at the end of 1941, when Japan made the spectacular miscalculation of attacking the United States naval base in the Pacific, instantly transforming China's lonely struggle into one theatre of a global war. Suddenly the great powers were allies, and American aid began to flow toward the beleaguered Chinese government, eventually amounting to well over $1.5 billion in military assistance. There was, however, a serious logistical catch. The Japanese had cut off virtually every land route into the unoccupied interior, which meant that supplies had to be flown in over one of the most dangerous air routes ever attempted, across the towering eastern flank of the Himalayas. Pilots called this perilous passage the Hump, and flying it meant battling brutal winds, towering peaks, savage weather, and minimal navigation aids, with a sobering number of aircraft and crews lost to the mountains rather than to enemy fire. It was a triumph of sheer stubborn logistics, hauling fuel and weapons over the roof of the world because there was simply no other way in. The reason that mountain air route mattered so desperately was that the obvious overland supply line had been severed. A long winding road snaked up through the jungles and mountains of the country to China's southwest from the British colony next door, and it had been the main artery for foreign aid until the Japanese captured the territory at its far end, slamming the door shut. Reopening that road became an obsession for the Allies, and it led to a grueling campaign in the steaming jungles to the south, where Chinese, American and British forces fought the Japanese in some of the most miserable terrain on Earth, battling disease, monsoon, and an enemy skilled at jungle warfare. Eventually a new land route was carved through the mountains at enormous effort, but it came too late to change the fundamental shape of the war. Meanwhile, life in the foggy wartime capital was its own kind of ordeal. The mist that protected the city from bombing was only partial cover, and for years the population endured relentless air raids, huddling in caves and tunnels dug into the hillsides while bombs fell on the crowded streets above. The city swelled with refugees from the occupied regions. Food was scarce, and the government that ruled from this damp, overcrowded mountain stronghold grew steadily more isolated, more anxious, and more prone to the corruption and despair that flourish when a war drags on with no end in sight. It was, to put it mildly, not the triumphant headquarters of a confident nation, but it held, and holding was the whole point. Adding to the air effort was a famous group of American volunteer pilots who had begun flying for China even before their own country formally entered the war, painting fearsome shark mouths on the noses of their fighter planes and earning a fearsome reputation against the Japanese Air Force. Known as the Flying Tigers, they became celebrated symbols of the alliance and a much-needed morale boost, proof that China was no longer entirely alone in the skies. The romance of the story, however, masked a far less harmonious reality on the ground, because the partnership between the Chinese government and its American allies was, to put it diplomatically, strained. Nowhere was this strain more vivid than in the spectacularly bad relationship between Chiang Kai-shek and the senior American general sent to coordinate the war effort in the region. The general, a blunt, acid-tongued officer named Joseph Stilwell, regarded Chiang as corrupt, evasive, and far more interested in hoarding American supplies for the eventual resumption of his fight against the communists than in actually fighting the Japanese. Chiang, for his part, considered the general an arrogant foreigner who did not understand the political realities of holding a fractured country together. The general privately referred to Chiang by a thoroughly unflattering nickname involving a peanut, which gives you a sense of the warmth of their working relationship. Two strong-willed men who despised each other were supposed to be jointly running a war, an arrangement that worked about as well as you might expect and produced years of bickering, obstruction, and mutual contempt. For all these frictions, the war did accomplish one thing for China that decades of humiliation had denied it. Having held out against Japan for so long and at such cost, the country was now treated, at least formally, as one of the major Allied powers. Chiang was invited to a wartime summit alongside the leaders of the United States and Britain, where the great powers discussed the shape of the post-war world and pledged that the territories Japan had stripped away, including the northeastern region and the large island off the coast, would be returned to China after victory. For a nation that had spent a century being carved up and dictated to by foreigners, sitting at the top table as a recognized great power was a remarkable reversal, even if the reality on the ground remained grim. It planted the seed of an idea that would matter enormously later, the notion that China belonged among the leading nations of the earth rather than at their mercy. The grimness of that reality was driven home during the stalemate years by yet another disaster. This one a massive famine that struck a major agricultural province in the early 1940s. A combination of drought, locusts, wartime requisitioning, and official indifference produced mass starvation that killed millions, and the government's slow and inadequate response, while it continued collecting grain taxes from the starving, did further damage to its standing among the very people it depended on. It was one more entry in the long ledger of suffering that the war years inflicted on the rural population, And one more reason the government in the foggy mountain capital was steadily hemorrhaging the trust of its citizens. While the Allies squabbled, the Japanese were not finished. In 1944, in a massive offensive across a huge stretch of territory, Japanese forces launched their largest land campaign of the entire war, aimed at knocking out Chinese airfields and opening an overland corridor through the country. The offensive smashed through the exhausted, poorly equipped, and poorly led nationalist armies, inflicting a devastating series of defeats and exposing just how hollowed out Chiang's military had become after years of attrition, corruption, and neglect. It was a humiliating reversal that badly damaged the nationalist prestige at the worst possible moment, and it suggested that, left to fight on the ground alone, China might have struggled on indefinitely without ever decisively winning. In the end, China's deliverance came not from its own battlefields, but from events on the other side of the world. By the summer of 1945, the wider war was collapsing in on Japan from every direction. The American campaign across the Pacific had brought devastation to the Japanese home islands, and then, in the war's terrible final act, 2 cities were destroyed by a new and apocalyptic kind of weapon. At almost the same moment, the Soviet Union, which had stayed out of the Pacific War until then, suddenly declared war on Japan and poured an enormous army into the northeastern region, smashing the Japanese forces there with overwhelming speed. Caught between these blows, Japan surrendered. The 8-year nightmare was over, but victory had come at a price almost too vast to comprehend. The war had killed somewhere between 15 and 20 million Chinese people, the overwhelming majority of them civilians, and had reduced much of the country to ruin. It was one of the deadliest national ordeals of the entire century, a catastrophe that touched nearly every family. And here lies one of the great bitter ironies of the whole period. The nationalist government had borne the brunt of the conventional fighting against Japan for 8 long years, and that effort had bled its armies white, drained its treasury, and exhausted its prestige. The communists, by contrast, holed up in their northwestern base, had largely avoided the most ruinous head-on battles, instead expanding quietly through the countryside of the occupied regions, organising peasants and building up their forces while the nationalists wore themselves down. When the smoke cleared, Chiang had won the war against Japan but emerged weaker, while his old domestic enemy had emerged stronger. The stage was set for the 2 suns to finally collide. For a brief, hopeful moment, it looked as though that collision might be avoided. In the immediate aftermath of victory, with the whole world exhausted and the United States eager to prevent another war, the 2 great rivals actually sat down to talk. Mao Zedong himself flew to the wartime capital for negotiations with Chiang Kai-shek, an extraordinary face-to-face meeting between the 2 men who would define China's future, and they smiled, raised toasts, and issued statements about peace and cooperation. Nobody believed a word of it. The fundamental problem was the same one that had haunted the country since the empire fell, the question of who would ultimately hold power, and on that question neither man was prepared to yield an inch. As the old saying went, the sky cannot hold 2 suns, and a single country could not contain 2 armies and 2 governments, each convinced it was the rightful ruler. The talks produced warm words and no substance, and by 1946 the guns were firing again, this time in the all-out civil war that would settle everything. Before that happened, the United States made one last earnest attempt to prevent the catastrophe. Eager to avoid a Chinese civil war that might drag in the great powers, Washington dispatched one of its most respected statesmen, a famous general turned diplomat, to mediate between the 2 sides and broker a power-sharing arrangement. He spent the better part of a year shuttling between the rivals, arranging ceasefires that both sides promptly violated, and trying to coax 2 parties who fully intended to destroy each other into forming a coalition government. It was a thankless and ultimately hopeless task, rather like being asked to negotiate a marriage between 2 people who keep trying to shoot each other across the table. The mission failed completely. The mediator went home in frustration, and the slide into full civil war became unstoppable. At the outset, the contest looked desperately lopsided in the nationalists' favour, and most outside observers expected Chiang to win without much trouble. He had a far larger army, vastly more equipment, control of the major cities and industries, and continued substantial support from the United States. The communists, by comparison, looked like the underdogs they had always been. In the early going, the nationalists confirmed these expectations by going on the offensive and scoring symbolic victories, even capturing the Communists' famous northwestern capital, the very refuge at the end of the Great March, and seizing key cities in the industrial northeast. On a map, it appeared that the government was winning, but the map was deceiving, because the real contest was being decided in the villages, not in the capture of cities. The Communists, drawing on everything they had learned in their years in the rural wilderness, fought a patient war for the loyalty of the peasantry, and their most powerful weapon was not a gun but a policy. In the vast countryside they controlled, they carried out sweeping land redistribution, seizing the holdings of landlords and dividing them among the poor farmers who had worked that soil in poverty for generations. To a peasant who had never owned anything, the promise of his own plot of land was worth more than any speech about national unity, and it turned millions of ordinary rural people into committed supporters who fed the armies, carried their supplies, hid their fighters, and filled their ranks. Combined with the mobile, hit-and-run style of warfare they had perfected, this rural foundation let the communist forces grow with astonishing speed. Under a brilliant and ruthlessly capable young commander named Lin Biao, the renamed Communist Army, now calling itself the People's Liberation Army, swelled to a force approaching 1 million troops in the northeast alone. Meanwhile, the nationalist government was rotting from the inside in a way that no amount of American equipment could fix. The most visible symptom was an economic catastrophe of almost surreal proportions. The government, unable to fund its enormous war effort honestly, simply printed money, and the result was hyperinflation so extreme that prices doubled in days and then in hours, that people carried bricks of banknotes in sacks and wheelbarrows just to buy basic goods, and that the paper currency eventually became worth so little it was reportedly cheaper to use it as fuel or wallpaper than to spend it. This is the kind of economic collapse that destroys a government's legitimacy more thoroughly than any battlefield defeat, because it impoverishes and enrages absolutely everyone, including the middle-class city dwellers who had been the nationalists' natural supporters. Pair that with rampant corruption among officials and officers who lined their own pockets, while soldiers went unpaid and unfed, and you have a regime steadily losing the will of its own people even as it held its weapons. By late 1948, the tide had turned decisively, and it turned in the form of 3 colossal campaigns fought over the course of a few months that effectively decided the war. In a sequence of enormous battles across the north and northeast, fought between the autumn of 1948 and the start of 1949, the People's Liberation Army shattered the main nationalist field armies one after another. These were not small engagements, but vast operations involving millions of soldiers and civilians, and their outcome was decisive and crushing. Over the span of these campaigns, the nationalists lost something north of 500,000 of their best troops, along with the modern American-supplied equipment that had been their great advantage, much of which was simply captured intact and turned against its former owners. Whole armies surrendered or defected. In the space of a single winter, the military balance that had seemed so lopsided at the start of the war was not merely evened but completely reversed. A large part of this collapse came not from firepower, but from sheer loss of will. By this stage, surrendering or switching sides had become almost routine among nationalist commanders, some of whom handed over entire fortified cities and their garrisons intact, rather than fight a war they no longer believed in. In the northeast, the campaign under the brilliant young communist commander turned on the patient encirclement of key cities, cutting them off from supply and reinforcement until the trapped defenders, starving and demoralized, gave up or were overwhelmed. These were sieges on an immense scale, and the suffering of the trapped civilian populations within the surrounded cities was severe, a reminder that even a war being won is never won cleanly. Once the northeast fell, with its industry and the captured stockpiles of modern weapons, the momentum became unstoppable, and the central campaign that followed encircled and destroyed an enormous nationalist concentration in the heartland, effectively breaking the back of Chiang's remaining strength. After that, the collapse was swift. With his best forces destroyed and his government discredited, Chiang could not hold the line. In the spring of 1949, the Communist armies swept south across the Great River, and the major cities fell in quick succession, including the nationalist capital and the great commercial metropolis on the coast that had seen so much of this story's bloodshed. The end of the long struggle arrived on the first day of October in 1949, when Mao Zedong stood atop the Great Gate in the heart of the old northern capital, looking out over an enormous crowd, and proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. The handful of idealists from the boat on the lake had, in just under 3 decades taken the entire country. It was an outcome that almost nobody outside their own ranks would have predicted at the start, and it remade the world's most populous nation in a single stroke, setting in motion changes that would touch the life of nearly every person within its borders for decades to come. The cost of these final 4 years of civil war was itself enormous, piled on top of everything that had come before. The fighting killed well over 2 million soldiers and something like 5 million civilians, a grim coda to a generation of almost continuous warfare. And for the losing side, the story did not quite end in total annihilation. Chiang Kai-shek, refusing to surrender, gathered up what remained of his government, his army, his treasury, and the great art treasures of the old imperial collections, and along with roughly 2 million followers, he retreated across the strait to the large island off the southeastern coast. There he would rebuild a rival Chinese state and cling to the claim that he, not Mao, remained the legitimate ruler of all China. He fully expected to regroup and return to reclaim the mainland someday. He never did, and he would never set foot on it again. The retreat across the water was, in its way, one of the largest organized evacuations of its kind in history, and Chiang did not leave empty-handed. Along with his soldiers and officials, he shipped out much of the country's remaining gold reserves and an extraordinary collection of imperial treasures and artworks, centuries of priceless paintings, bronzes, and antiquities, carefully crated up and carried across the strait. To this day, those treasures form the heart of one of the world's great museums on the island, a slightly awkward arrangement given that the mainland would very much like them back. It was the cultural inheritance of an entire civilization, packed into ships and spirited away by the losing side of a civil war, which is not something that happens every day. It is worth pausing on just how completely the nationalists had lost the argument by the end, because military defeat was only part of it. In the final years, even the students, intellectuals, and city dwellers who had once been the regime's natural constituency had turned against it, sickened by the corruption, broken by the hyperinflation, and exhausted by decades of war and broken promises. A government can survive losing battles, but it cannot easily survive losing the faith of the very people it claims to represent, and the nationalists had managed to lose both at once. The communists, whatever else one might say about them, had offered a hungry and battered population something concrete and immediate, and in the simplest terms that is how a movement of 13 men in a borrowed boat ended up ruling a quarter of humanity. The mainland was now firmly in the hands of the communists, and an entirely new and equally turbulent chapter of Chinese history was about to begin under the leadership of the country boy who had bet everything on the peasants, and won. Winning a country, however, turns out to be the easy part. Governing one of a quarter of all humanity, rebuilding it from the rubble of 40 years of war, and reshaping it according to a revolutionary blueprint would prove a challenge of an entirely different order, and the decades ahead would contain triumphs and disasters on a scale to match everything that had come before. The country that the victors inherited in 1949 was, to put it gently, a fixer-upper. 40 years of warlords, invasion, and civil war had left the economy in ruins, the currency worthless, the infrastructure shattered, and a population exhausted and desperately poor. The new rulers had spent decades as revolutionaries and guerrilla fighters, which is excellent training for seizing a country and almost none at all for running one. Overnight, men who had spent their adult lives sleeping in mountain caves and planning ambushes were expected to manage railways, banks, factories, harvests, and the daily needs of roughly a quarter of all the people on Earth. The learning curve, as you might imagine, was steep. Power in this new state was organized in a way that would shape everything that followed, and it is worth understanding the structure because it explains so much. Although the country had a government on paper, with ministries and titles and all the usual furniture of a modern state, real authority rested with the Communist Party, and within the party it rested with a very small group of men at the very top. The handful of senior leaders who sat on the party's innermost council held the genuine power, and at the center of that group stood 3 figures who would dominate the era. There was Mao Zedong, the supreme leader and the movement's living symbol, whose word increasingly carried the weight of scripture. There was Liu Shaoqi, a serious methodical organization man widely seen as the heir apparent, and the person who actually understood how to make a bureaucracy function. And there was Zhou Enlai, the urbane and endlessly capable diplomat and administrator, who had brokered so many of the party's crises, a man so smooth and indispensable that he survived at the top through decades of upheaval that destroyed nearly everyone around him. Together, this trio formed the core of the new regime, with Mao as the undisputed first among them. Rebuilding a wrecked country from scratch is not something you do alone, and the new government had exactly one obvious source of expertise to draw on. Having allied itself firmly with the great communist power to the north, China invited in a small army of foreign specialists to help build its new state. Roughly 10,000 Soviet advisors fanned out across the country, helping to design factories, plan industries, organize the bureaucracy, and train a new generation of Chinese engineers and managers. They brought blueprints, machinery, and technical know-how, and for a few years the relationship between the two communist giants looked like a model of socialist brotherhood, all smiles and joint projects and speeches about eternal friendship. Anyone familiar with how this story eventually turns out will appreciate the irony, but for now the partnership was genuine and enormously important to getting China's industry off the ground. Before any of this rebuilding could proceed, the new rulers felt they had to secure their grip, and the early years of the regime were marked by a series of sweeping political campaigns aimed at rooting out anyone who might oppose the new order. There was a drive against so-called counter-revolutionaries, a broad and elastic category that could include former officials of the defeated government, members of secret societies, religious organizers, and anyone else suspected of clinging to loyalties from the old world. These campaigns swept up huge numbers of people in their nets, and they made unmistakably clear that dissent under the new dispensation would not be a low-risk activity. The party also turned its attention to the cities, where it faced a problem it had thought about far less than the countryside. The urban economy still ran largely on private business, on shopkeepers, merchants, factory owners, and the whole machinery of commerce, and the new rulers regarded this capitalist class with deep suspicion, even as they needed its expertise to keep the cities running. Their solution came in two linked campaigns, one aimed at corruption and waste within the party and bureaucracy itself, and a parallel one aimed at the business community targeting practices like bribery, tax evasion, and fraud. In practice, these drives subjected the urban merchant class to relentless pressure, public confessions, and crippling fines, steadily breaking their independence and bending them to the will of the state. Over the following years, private businesses were gradually absorbed into joint state-private arrangements and then into outright public ownership, so that by the middle of the decade, independent capitalism in the cities had been quietly squeezed out of existence. It was a remarkably thorough transformation, accomplished less through dramatic confiscation than through steady, inescapable pressure, the bureaucratic equivalent of slowly closing a fist. Running alongside all of this was an effort to reshape not just institutions but minds. Intellectuals, professionals, and former members of the old elite were put through extensive sessions of what the regime called thought reform, a process of intense study, self-criticism, and public confession designed to remold their thinking along approved lines. People were expected to examine their own pasts, denounce their former bourgeois attitudes, and demonstrate their conversion to the new way of seeing the world. To a modern observer, it can sound like an unusually demanding corporate onboarding program, except that the stakes were one's freedom and future rather than a performance review, and the sincerity of one's enthusiasm was not optional. The most urgent and far-reaching change the new rulers pursued in their first years was in the countryside, where, as we have seen, the overwhelming majority of the population lived, and where the revolution had won its support in the first place. The party now carried out a sweeping land reform across the entire country, on a scale that dwarfed anything attempted before. The basic idea was simple and, to a poor farmer, enormously appealing. The land held by landlords and wealthy rural families was confiscated and redistributed to the peasants who actually worked it, fulfilling the promise that had filled the communist ranks with eager recruits. Something like 300 million peasants received land of their own, an almost unimaginable transfer of property that genuinely transformed rural life for millions of families. But this reform had a darker side that must be recorded honestly. The process was not a quiet matter of paperwork and surveyors. It was deliberately violent and political, designed to break the old rural power structure permanently by turning the village against its former masters. Mass meetings were held in which landlords were denounced, accused, and frequently condemned to death by the very communities they had once dominated, in a furious settling of generations of accumulated grievance. The number of landlords and others killed in this campaign across the country ran well over 1 million people. It was a brutal social transformation, accomplished through fear as much as fairness, and it permanently shattered the centuries-old order of rural China. Whatever one thinks of it, there was no going back to the old world after this. Alongside the upheaval in the fields came an equally dramatic transformation in the home, embodied in one of the new state's most genuinely progressive achievements. In 1950, the government passed a sweeping new marriage law that struck directly at some of the most deeply entrenched traditions of the old society. It outlawed arranged and forced marriages, banned the keeping of concubines, prohibited the buying and selling of brides, and gave women the right to initiate divorce, all of which represented a revolution in the status of women that the reformers of earlier generations had only dreamed about. For countless women trapped in marriages they had never chosen, this was nothing short of liberation, and the law unleashed a wave of divorce petitions from women eager to escape unhappy unions. It was not universally welcomed, naturally, particularly by the husbands and families who suddenly found that the rules had changed underneath them, but it marked a genuine and lasting shift in Chinese society. The texture of everyday life was changing in deeper ways too, as the state extended its reach into corners of existence that no previous Chinese government had ever bothered to organize. In the cities, the workplace became the basic unit of life through a system in which a person's employer was responsible, not just for their job, but for their housing, their healthcare, their food rations, permission to marry or travel, and a great deal else besides. Belonging to one of these units gave a person security and a place in the new order, but it also meant that the state, through one's workplace, had a hand in nearly every important decision of one's life. It was cradle-to-grave provision combined with cradle-to-grave supervision, and the two came as an inseparable package. A complementary system of household registration tied people to the place they were born, sharply limiting movement between the countryside and the cities, and effectively creating two separate worlds with very different rights and rations, a divide that would have enormous consequences down the line. The new state also gave itself a formal constitutional structure in the middle of the decade, establishing on paper a national legislature and the familiar architecture of a modern republic. In practice, as we have seen, real power continued to flow through the party rather than through these governmental bodies, which tended to ratify decisions already made elsewhere rather than make them. Still, the formal framework mattered, lending the regime an air of legality and permanence, and laying out, at least in theory, the rights and duties of citizens in the new society. It was the kind of document that looked impressive framed on a wall, even if the day-to-day reality of power owed more to the small group of men at the top than to anything written in it. The new state also turned its attention to the written word itself, tackling a problem that earlier reformers had identified but never solved at scale. As we touched on earlier, the traditional writing system was fiendishly difficult to learn, which kept literacy locked up among a small educated minority. The new government launched a major effort to simplify the most common written characters, reducing the number of strokes needed to write them and making them genuinely easier to learn and remember. Paired with mass literacy campaigns aimed at teaching ordinary workers and peasants to read, this was part of a serious push to drag the population out of widespread illiteracy. It worked, slowly but surely, and the simplified writing system remains in use across the mainland to this day, one of the more quietly durable legacies of these years. Public health was another arena where the early regime, for all its harshness, delivered real and measurable improvements to ordinary lives. The country it inherited was ravaged by disease, with epidemics, parasites, and appalling sanitation taking a constant toll, particularly in the countryside. The new state threw itself into mass campaigns to clean up water supplies, vaccinate the population, and combat the pests and parasites that spread illness, mobilizing enormous numbers of people to drain swamps, kill disease-carrying creatures, and improve basic hygiene. Some of these efforts had a distinctly heavy-handed flavour, including a notorious nationwide drive to exterminate certain birds and pests that had unintended ecological consequences nobody had thought through, a reminder that boundless enthusiasm is no substitute for actually understanding an ecosystem. But the broader push genuinely worked. Deadly diseases that had plagued the country for centuries were brought under control or eliminated. Infant mortality fell, and life expectancy began a steady climb upward. For all the political terror of these years, a peasant in the 1950s could reasonably expect to live considerably longer than his parents had, which is not nothing. The new rulers were also determined to assemble and secure the full territory they claimed as China, which led to military campaigns on the distant frontiers. In the far west, the vast and ethnically diverse region of deserts and mountains was brought firmly under central control between 1949 and 1951. And in the remote high plateau to the southwest, the army moved in to assert authority over a land that had functioned with considerable autonomy under its own religious leadership, formally bringing it into the new state. These were sensitive and contested actions whose consequences would echo for decades, and they reflected the new government's iron determination that the humiliating dismemberment of the past century would never be repeated, and that every corner of the claimed territory would answer to the capital. In the case of the High Plateau, the takeover was initially wrapped in an agreement that promised to preserve the region's traditional religious and social system and its existing leadership, at least for a time, in exchange for accepting central sovereignty. For a few years, an uneasy arrangement held, with the old order left largely in place on the surface, while real authority shifted steadily toward the central government. It was the kind of compromise that tends to satisfy nobody for long, a temporary truce between two fundamentally incompatible visions of how the region should be governed, and the tensions simmering beneath it would eventually boil over into open revolt later on. But that confrontation belonged to the future. For the moment, the map of the new China was complete, every distant frontier nominally secured, and the leadership could turn its full attention inward to the great project of transformation. On the world stage, the young republic anchored itself firmly to its great communist neighbour. Mao made the long journey north to negotiate with the Soviet leader, a notoriously prickly and suspicious man, and after weeks of tense and reportedly rather frosty bargaining, the two signed a formal treaty of alliance and friendship in early 1950. For Mao, sitting in the anteroom waiting for an audience with a host who was in no hurry to grant one, the experience was apparently a humbling reminder of who the senior partner in this friendship was meant to be. Still, the treaty gave China a powerful protector and a vital source of aid, loans and technology at a moment when the Western powers regarded the new regime with open hostility. China had chosen its side in the emerging global standoff, and it had chosen decisively. That choice was put to a brutal test almost immediately, in a conflict that erupted on China's doorstep and dragged the young nation into a war it had hardly finished one of its own to fight. On the peninsula to the northeast, the communist North invaded the American-backed South, and when a United States-led international force pushed the invaders back and advanced toward the Chinese border, the leadership in the capital concluded that they could not allow a hostile army to sit on their frontier. China intervened on a massive scale, sending wave after wave of soldiers across the border into a grinding, bloody 3-year war against the most powerful military on Earth. Over the course of the conflict, China funneled an enormous number of troops into the fight, with total Chinese forces involved running into the millions. To preserve the fiction that it was not formally at war with the United States, China sent its troops in under the label of volunteers, as though millions of soldiers had spontaneously decided to take a working holiday across the border out of pure enthusiasm. Nobody was fooled, but the diplomatic fig leaf served its purpose. On the battlefield, the Chinese forces relied on numbers, surprise, and sheer endurance to offset their enormous disadvantage in firepower, launching massed night attacks and infiltration tactics that initially stunned their better-equipped opponents and drove them into headlong retreat. But against an enemy with overwhelming artillery, air power, and supply, those tactics came at a terrible price in lives, especially once the front stabilized into static, trench-bound fighting reminiscent of an earlier world war. The cost was staggering. Fighting a technologically superior enemy across frozen mountains and shattered valleys, Chinese forces suffered horrendous casualties, with deaths numbering well over 500,000. The war also touched the supreme leader personally in a way that humanized this otherwise impersonal catastrophe. Mao's own eldest son, serving in the conflict, was killed in an air raid, a loss the famously hardened leader is said to have absorbed with grim stoicism, refusing to have the young man's remains returned home on the grounds that the sons of ordinary families were dying too. The war eventually ground to an exhausted stalemate near where it had begun, and the consequences for China were profound. The conflict cemented the hostility between China and the Western powers, brought a punishing economic embargo down on the new state, and prompted the United States to position its fleet in the strait to shield the rival government on the island, ensuring that the unfinished civil war would stay frozen across that stretch of water for generations. Whatever else it accomplished, the war announced to the world that the new China was willing to fight the strongest army on the planet to a standstill, and that announcement was heard. With the most dangerous external crisis stabilized, the government turned to the great project of transforming the economy along socialist lines, and here it leaned heavily on the model of its northern ally. In 1953, China launched its first comprehensive economic plan, a 5-year blueprint focused on rapid industrialization, channeling resources into heavy industry, steel, machinery, and the kind of massive factories and mines that the planners regarded as the backbone of a modern socialist power. With Soviet help and technology, the results in this area were genuinely impressive. Industrial output climbed sharply, entire new industrial cities rose from the ground, and in a milestone that mattered enormously for a country with grand ambitions and few resources, China developed its own oil production for the first time, beginning the long process of freeing itself from dependence on imported fuel. For all the upheaval elsewhere, this push to build a modern industrial base was a real and substantial achievement, and it laid foundations that the country would build on for decades. Much of this industrial leap rested on a package of large-scale projects designed and equipped with Soviet help. Complete factories and plants transplanted more or less wholesale from the Northern Ally, which sent the machinery, the blueprints, and the experts to install and run them. For the Chinese engineers and workers learning at their elbow, it was an invaluable education, and for a few years the arrangement embodied the promised brotherhood between the two communist powers. Yet beneath the surface, strains were already beginning to show. The aid was not a gift, but came largely in the form of loans that China was expected to repay, often in scarce food and raw materials, and the relationship carried an unmistakable flavour of senior partner and junior dependent that grated on a leadership fiercely proud of having won its own revolution, without much help from anyone. Mao, in particular, chafed at the idea that the path to socialism had to follow a foreign template handed down from abroad. These were small clouds on an otherwise sunny horizon for the moment, but they would darken into a full storm soon enough, with consequences that would reshape the global balance of power. The same drive towards socialism reshaped the countryside once again, only a few years after the land reform had handed peasants their own plots. Having given farmers private land, the party now began, gently at first and then with increasing pressure, to take it back into collective ownership. Peasants were encouraged and then pushed to pool their land, tools and labour into cooperatives, larger collective farming units that the leadership believed would be more efficient and more in keeping with socialist principles. The pace of this collectivization accelerated rapidly, and by 1956 the overwhelming majority of rural households, something like 80%, had been folded into these cooperatives. The irony of giving people their own land and then absorbing it into a collective just a few years later was not lost on everyone, but the direction of travel was clear and private farming was steadily disappearing. The speed of this collectivization was itself the subject of a quiet but important argument at the top of the party, one that previewed the great divisions to come. Some of the more cautious leaders, the methodical organization men who actually had to make the system function, favored a gradual approach, worried that pushing the peasants too fast would disrupt production and breed resentment. Mao, by contrast, grew impatient with this caution and pressed for a dramatic acceleration, convinced that the masses were readier for socialism than his timid colleagues believed, and that bold leadership could simply sweep the doubters along. He got his way, and the pace of collectivization leapt forward far faster than the cautious planners had wanted. It was a small victory for Mao's instinct that revolutionary will could override practical limits, an instinct that had served him brilliantly in the guerrilla years. The trouble was that running an economy is not the same as running an insurgency, and the same boldness that wins wars can wreck harvests. That lesson was still a couple of years away, but the pattern that would produce catastrophe was already visible to anyone paying close attention. By the mid-1950s, then, the new state had accomplished an astonishing amount in a remarkably short time. It had unified and pacified the country, rebuilt a shattered economy, fought the world's strongest power to a draw, launched industrialization, transformed the position of women, and begun the long climb out of mass illiteracy. The leadership had reason to feel confident, perhaps even a little too confident, and it was in this mood that Mao launched one of the most curious and consequential episodes of the entire period, an experiment that would reveal a great deal about both the regime and its leader. It is worth noting just how thoroughly the new order had woven itself into the fabric of daily life by this point, because politics was no longer something that happened in distant offices. The state ran on near-constant mass campaigns, each with its slogans, its rallies, its quotas, and its public meetings, and ordinary people were expected to participate with visible enthusiasm whether they felt it or not. Loudspeakers, posters, newspapers, and study sessions saturated the country with the party's message, and the figure of Mao himself was steadily being elevated from leader to something closer to a secular saint, his portrait appearing everywhere and his pronouncements treated as the final word on questions great and small. This adoration was still relatively restrained compared to the frenzy that would come later, but the foundations of a genuine cult of personality were being laid, and the habit of treating one man's judgment as infallible would soon prove extraordinarily dangerous. When a whole system is built around the assumption that the leader cannot be wrong, the leader's mistakes stop being correctable, which is a fine arrangement right up until he makes a big one. The idea, on its surface, sounded almost liberal. In 1956 and into 1957, Mao invited the country's intellectuals, scholars, artists, and ordinary citizens to openly criticize the party and the government, to point out its failings and offer suggestions for improvement. The campaign was promoted with a poetic slogan about letting 100 flowers bloom and 100 schools of thought contend, the notion being that open debate and constructive criticism would strengthen the new society and air out problems before they festered. After years of revolutionary discipline, this invitation to speak freely was met at first with caution, since people were understandably wary, but as it became clear that criticism really was being encouraged, the floodgates opened. And here the experiment took a sharp and ominous turn. The criticism, when it finally came pouring out, was far harsher and far more fundamental than the leadership had anticipated. Instead of polite suggestions about improving this or that policy, intellectuals questioned the party's monopoly on power, attacked the privileges of officials, and in some cases challenged the very foundations of the system. Whether Mao had genuinely expected gentle feedback and was shocked by the fury, or whether the whole thing had been a deliberate trap to flush dissenters into the open, is a question historians still debate, and the honest answer is probably some uncomfortable mixture of the two. Mao himself, in the aftermath, offered a chillingly candid explanation, suggesting that the campaign had served to lure the hidden enemies of socialism out into the open where they could be identified and dealt with, comparing it to enticing snakes out of their holes. Whether that was his plan all along, or a convenient justification invented after the fact, it hardly mattered to the people on the receiving end. Either way, the response was swift and merciless. The invitation to speak freely was abruptly reversed, and those who had taken it up found themselves in the crosshairs of a sweeping crackdown. This crackdown became known as the anti-rightist campaign, and it fell with crushing force in 1957 on the very people who had been encouraged to speak. Hundreds of thousands of intellectuals, professionals, and outspoken citizens were branded as enemies of socialism, stripped of their positions, publicly humiliated, and in many cases sent away to labour in the countryside or worse, with the number of those punished reaching at least 500,000 people. It was a catastrophe for the educated class, and a brutal lesson in the dangers of taking an official invitation to criticise at face value, a lesson that would keep people quiet for a very long time afterward. The campaign decapitated independent thought in the country, and taught a generation that candour could be fatal to one's career and freedom, which is not generally how a healthy relationship between a government and its citizens is supposed to work. The damage went well beyond the individuals who were punished. Among those branded and silenced were many of the country's best-trained engineers, scientists, doctors, teachers, and economists, precisely the kind of expertise a poor nation trying to modernize could least afford to lose. Sending skilled professionals off to shovel manure in the countryside as punishment for honest criticism is not, on reflection, an obvious way to accelerate a country's development, and the loss of their knowledge and judgment would be felt for years. Just as importantly, it terrified the survivors into silence. The experts who remained learned that the safest course was to tell their superiors whatever they wanted to hear, and never, under any circumstances, to point out that a plan might not work. This is a catastrophic quality to instill in the people whose job is to warn you when you're about to drive off a cliff, and the consequences of that enforced silence were about to become horrifyingly clear. The campaign also gave a major boost to the career of a figure who had been steadily climbing the party ranks, and who would loom enormous over the rest of this story. A small, tough, intensely practical veteran of the revolution named Deng Xiaoping played a leading organisational role in carrying out the anti-rightist purge, demonstrating exactly the kind of administrative ruthlessness and reliability that the leadership valued. It is one of history's odder twists that the very man who helped orchestrate this crackdown on free expression would decades later become the architect of the reforms that opened China to the world. But that is getting well ahead of our story. For now, Deng was a rising enforcer, and his moment at the very top was still many turbulent years away. So as the first decade of communist rule drew toward its close, the new China stood at a crossroads, flush with genuine achievements, but also with a leadership that had just demonstrated its willingness to turn savagely on its own people, and a supreme leader growing ever more confident in the power of revolutionary will to reshape reality itself. The careful, methodical, Soviet-style building of the early years had produced real results, but Mao was growing impatient with its caution and its reliance on technical experts and foreign advisors. He was beginning to dream of a faster, bolder, uniquely Chinese path to a communist utopia, one that would rely not on plodding plans and foreign blueprints, but on the sheer revolutionary energy of hundreds of millions of mobilized people. It was a dream of breathtaking ambition, and it was about to collide with reality in one of the greatest catastrophes of the 20th century, a disaster born not of foreign enemies or natural calamity, but of the conviction that sheer human determination could simply overrule the laws of economics and nature alike. The triumphant first decade, in other words, was about to give way to a tragedy that no amount of revolutionary will could prevent. The conviction that human willpower could simply overrule the laws of nature found its purest and most disastrous expression in 1958, in a campaign whose very name promised the impossible. Mao had grown convinced that China could leapfrog the slow, plodding stages of development that other countries had endured, and that through sheer mass mobilization and revolutionary enthusiasm, the nation could vault into a communist future practically overnight, overtaking the advanced industrial powers in a matter of years rather than generations. It was an intoxicating vision, and the fact that it bore no relationship whatsoever to how economies actually work did nothing to dampen the leadership's enthusiasm. The whole country was about to be enlisted in an experiment of breathtaking scale, conducted with no test run and no backup plan, on the bodies of hundreds of millions of people. The first great pillar of this campaign was the reorganization of rural life on an even more radical scale than the cooperatives we discussed earlier. The collective farms were now merged into enormous units called people's communes, each gathering up tens of thousands of peasants into a single vast organization that controlled not just farming, but nearly every aspect of daily existence. Private plots were abolished, private cooking was discouraged or banned, and peasants were herded into communal dining halls where everyone ate together from a common kitchen. In the giddy early days, these canteens served food freely and without limit, on the theory that true communism had arrived and scarcity was a thing of the past. Peasants who had known hunger their whole lives were briefly encouraged to eat as much as they liked, which they understandably did, cheerfully demolishing the grain reserves under the impression that abundance was now permanent. Spoiler alert, it was not. The whole campaign ran on slogans and targets of almost cartoonish ambition. The leadership announced that China would catch up to and then overtake the leading industrial nation of the West within a mere 15 years, a goal roughly as realistic as deciding to win an Olympic marathon next month because you have purchased a very nice pair of running shoes. To meet these targets, the rural population was mobilized for gigantic public works projects, hauled off the fields in their millions to build dams, dig canals, and move mountains of earth by hand, often with little planning and disastrous engineering. Agricultural theory was rewritten on the fly according to fashionable but baseless ideas, with peasants ordered to plough their fields absurdly deep and to plant seeds so closely packed together that the crops choked and died, all on the authority of pseudo-scientific theories that promised miraculous yields and delivered ruined harvests. The labour that should have been tending the crops was diverted into furnaces and construction sites. The experienced farmers were overruled by enthusiastic officials with no idea what they were doing, and the stage was set for disaster even before the lying about the harvest began. It was a perfect storm of misplaced confidence, in which every decision that could go wrong was made to go wrong with tremendous energy and discipline. The second pillar was an obsession with steel, which Mao regarded as the great measure of industrial might. Rather than waiting to build proper modern steel mills, the campaign called on ordinary peasants to produce steel themselves in their own villages by constructing small crude furnaces in their backyards. Across the countryside, millions of people dutifully built these little smelters and fed them whatever metal they could find, melting down their own pots, pans, tools, and even door hinges in a frenzied effort to meet impossible production targets. The result, predictably to anyone who knew the first thing about metallurgy, was largely useless. The backyard furnaces produced lumps of brittle, low-grade pig iron that was good for almost nothing, while the countryside was stripped of the very tools and cookware the peasants needed to farm and eat. Entire forests were cut down to fuel the furnaces, and untold hours of labour that should have gone into the harvest were instead poured into manufacturing what amounted to scrap. It was the agricultural equivalent of burning your furniture to keep warm while ignoring that the house is on fire. All of this folly was wrapped in a relentless atmosphere of triumphant propaganda that insisted everything was going magnificently. Newspapers trumpeted record-breaking achievements, posters depicted beaming peasants surrounded by impossibly abundant harvests, and the airwaves filled with songs and slogans celebrating the glorious leap into the communist future. The official line was that the people's communes were wonderful, and that the campaign was an unqualified triumph, and to suggest otherwise was to risk being denounced as a defeatist. This created a bizarre and dangerous gap between the cheerful fantasy presented in the media and the grim reality taking shape in the fields, a gap that grew wider by the month. People learned to applaud the official story in public while privately watching their world fall apart, which is a deeply corrosive thing to ask of a population, and it meant that the truth had almost nowhere to surface. The louder the celebration, the more impossible it became for anyone to say what was actually happening, until the contradiction could no longer be sustained. But the truly fatal flaw in the whole scheme lay in the way information travelled, or rather failed to travel, up the chain of command. Here the lessons of the earlier purge came home to roost with horrifying force. As we saw, officials had learned that the safest thing to do was to report whatever their superiors wanted to hear, and never to deliver bad news. So when the central leadership demanded miraculous increases in grain production, local officials, terrified of being branded defeatists or rightists, simply reported miraculous increases, whether or not they had actually occurred. Each level of the bureaucracy inflated the numbers a little further to please the level above, and the fabricated harvest figures climbed to absurd heights, with some regions claiming yields that defied the laws of botany. The propaganda triumphantly published photographs of fields so densely packed with grain that children could supposedly sit on top of the crop, images that were, to put it charitably, staged. This cascade of lies had a lethal consequence. The government set the amount of grain it would requisition from the countryside based on these wildly inflated production figures, taking its share of harvests that existed only on paper. When officials came to collect the state's portion of a fantasy crop, they ended up seizing virtually all of the real grain that the villages had actually grown, often leaving the peasants who had produced it with nothing to eat. The very people who grew the nation's food were stripped of it to meet quotas based on harvest that had never happened. And because admitting that the figures were fake would mean admitting that the whole campaign was a failure, the machine kept grinding forward, requisitioning food from starving villages while the leadership in the capital believed the country was drowning in surplus. What followed was one of the worst famines in all of human history, a catastrophe made entirely by human decisions rather than by drought or flood, though some genuinely bad weather did make a bad situation worse. Across the vast rural interior, beginning around 1959 and stretching into the early 1960s, the food simply ran out. The communal canteens that had once dished out unlimited meals went empty. The seized grain rotted in state warehouses, or was even exported abroad to maintain the fiction of plenty, and the countryside descended into mass starvation on a scale almost impossible to grasp. The estimates of how many died are staggering, and have been revised steadily upward as researchers gained access to records, with modern scholarship putting the toll of excess deaths at no fewer than 45 million people, something like 7% of the entire population. This is not a subject for any lightness whatsoever. It was a human disaster of almost unimaginable proportions, and it fell hardest on the very peasants whose support had carried the revolution to power in the first place. Several features of the system turned a terrible situation into an inescapable trap. The household registration arrangement described earlier, which bound people to the place they were born, meant that starving peasants could not simply pack up and move to the cities in search of food, since without the proper documents they had no claim to rations or housing anywhere else. They were, in effect, sealed into the regions where the food had run out. Compounding this, the state continued to export grain abroad during the worst of the crisis, partly to maintain the prestige of a regime that could not admit its model was failing, and partly to repay foreign debts, so that food was leaving the country even as its own people starved. And because the official statistics still showed bountiful harvests, the leadership did not request the foreign food aid that might have eased the suffering, since one does not ask for help with a famine one has not admitted is happening. Each of these failures flowed directly from the central problem of a system that had made honesty dangerous and admitting error impossible. It was bureaucratic catastrophe layered upon ideological rigidity, and ordinary families paid the price. Astonishingly, for a long time the men at the very top genuinely did not grasp the scale of what was happening, insulated by the same wall of false reporting that had caused the disaster, travelling through carefully staged model villages where everything looked fine and surrounded by subordinates too frightened to tell them the truth. But not everyone stayed silent. At a major leadership conference in 1959 held at a mountain resort, a blunt and famously honest senior military commander decided that someone had to say what was actually going on in the countryside. This veteran defense leader, a hero of the revolution, wrote a measured private letter to Mao raising concerns about the excesses of the campaign and the suffering it was causing. It was about as polite and cautious a criticism as could be imagined, the kind of thing a loyal colleague offers in good faith. Mao did not take it that way. Interpreting the letter as a personal challenge to his authority and a threat to his leadership, he turned on the commander with fury, denounced him in front of the assembled leaders, and had him stripped of his posts and effectively purged. The message to everyone else was unmistakable. Even a decorated revolutionary hero who raised honest concerns in private could be destroyed for it, which meant that anyone with similar worries had better keep them firmly to themselves. The conference, which might have been a chance to halt the catastrophe before its worst phase, instead doubled down on the disastrous course and silenced the one voice brave enough to object. The famine ground on for another 2 terrible years, and a great many of those 45 million deaths came after the moment when the leadership could have changed course, but chose instead to defend its own infallibility. By around 1961, the catastrophe had grown too enormous to deny even at the very top, and reality finally forced its way through the wall of propaganda. Mao, his prestige badly damaged by the obvious failure of his grand experiment, stepped back from day-to-day control of the economy and retreated somewhat into the background, though he remained the supreme symbolic leader, and nobody dared to blame him openly. Into the vacuum stepped the more pragmatic and practical figures in the leadership, the methodical organization man who was Mao's designated heir, the indispensable diplomat administrator, and the tough little enforcer from the earlier purge whose talents now turned to repair work. These pragmatists quietly set about cleaning up the wreckage. The people's communes were scaled back and reorganized into smaller, more workable units. The disastrous communal canteens were abandoned. Peasants were allowed small private plots again to grow their own food, and material incentives crept back into the economy. It was a quiet, undramatic retreat from utopia toward common sense, and it slowly nursed the country back from the brink of total collapse. The man behind much of this practical recovery famously remarked that it did not matter whether a cat was black or white as long as it caught mice, a delightfully unideological sentiment that prioritized results over revolutionary purity, and one that Mao would later remember and resent. The recovery was accompanied by a moment of unusual candor at the top that would have enormous consequences down the road. At a large gathering of party officials from across the country in the early 1960s, Mao's pragmatic heir delivered a sober assessment of the disaster, acknowledging that the famine had been overwhelmingly caused by human policy errors rather than by bad weather, a frank admission that quietly but unmistakably laid the blame at the door of the campaign Mao had championed. It was as close as anyone dared come to telling the emperor he had made a catastrophic mistake. Mao sat through it, said the right things about taking responsibility, and filed the whole episode away. He did not forget who had stood up and described his grand vision as a failure, and the growing gap between the supreme leader, who still believed in revolutionary transformation, and the practical administrators, who wanted stability and prosperity, was hardening into a fundamental and dangerous divide at the heart of the leadership. Rather than accept this drift toward pragmatism, Mao began, from his position on the sidelines, to push back. In the early 1960s, he launched a movement aimed at reviving revolutionary commitment in the countryside and rooting out the corruption and capitalist tendencies he believed were creeping back in as the pragmatists relaxed controls. This effort was, in part, a vehicle for Mao to reassert his ideological authority and to express his mounting suspicion that the revolution was being betrayed from within by the very colleagues running the recovery. It produced friction and confusion more than results, but it mattered enormously as a warning sign because it revealed how Mao was coming to see his own pragmatic comrades not as loyal administrators cleaning up a mess, but as a hostile faction leading the country down the road to capitalism. That suspicion, nursed in the shadows over these years, was the seed from which a far greater storm would grow. For a few years, though, the practical men's medicine worked, and the country experienced a genuine if fragile recovery. Once the peasants were allowed to grow food on their own small plots again, and to sell surplus produce in revived rural markets, production rebounded with the speed that tends to follow whenever people are permitted to work in their own self-interest. Grain output climbed back toward survivable levels, the worst of the starvation receded, and the population, which had actually shrunk during the famine, began to grow again. Life in the early to middle 1960s eased into something approaching normalcy, with a modest revival of consumer goods, a relaxation of the most extreme ideological pressure, and a cautious sense that the country had survived its self-inflicted ordeal and was getting back on its feet. Writers and artists enjoyed slightly more breathing room, schools and universities functioned, and the experts the regime so badly needed were quietly brought back into useful work. It was, by the standards of this turbulent era, a relatively calm and rational interlude. The tragedy is that it did not last, because the calm depended entirely on the pragmatists remaining in charge, and the one man with the power to overturn them all had no intention of letting their sensible, undramatic governance define the future of his revolution. While this domestic catastrophe was unfolding, China was also experiencing a dramatic and consequential rupture in its most important foreign relationship, the alliance with its great communist neighbour to the north. The cracks we glimpsed earlier widened into a full breach over the course of these years, and the reasons were a tangle of ideology, ego, and strategic interest. The trouble had begun a couple of years before, when the new Soviet leader stunned the communist world by delivering a secret speech denouncing the crimes and cult of personality of his predecessor, the late dictator whom Mao had always treated as the towering figure of world communism. To Mao, this denunciation was deeply alarming, partly because he had built up a cult of personality of his own that looked uncomfortably similar, and partly because he increasingly saw the new Soviet leadership as soft, revisionist, and insufficiently committed to genuine revolution. Relations deteriorated further amid disputes over how to deal with the West, with the Soviets pursuing a cautious policy of peaceful coexistence with the capitalist powers, while Mao struck a more militant pose. A flare-up of tension across the strait from the rival island government in 1958, during which Chinese forces shelled the offshore islands held by the nationalists, alarmed the Soviets, who had no desire to be dragged into a war over a few rocky islands, and resented not being consulted. This confrontation produced one of the more surreal arrangements in the history of modern warfare. After the initial intense bombardment failed to dislodge the nationalists, and with neither side willing to escalate to a full invasion, the shelling settled into a strange and almost ritualized routine. By unofficial understanding, the mainland artillery would fire on the islands only on odd-numbered days, while even-numbered days were left quiet so that supplies could be brought in, an accommodation that turned a military siege into something resembling a part-time job with a fixed schedule. Much of what was fired eventually consisted of shells, stuffed with propaganda leaflets rather than explosives, so that the two sides were essentially lobbing political pamphlets at one another on alternating days for years. It was a peculiar, low-simmering standoff that allowed both governments to maintain their postures of defiance without actually fighting a war, and it carried on in this fashion long after everyone had stopped paying close attention. Trust evaporated on both sides. The breaking point came when the Soviets, who had been helping China develop advanced technology, including the beginnings of a nuclear program, abruptly cut off that assistance, reneging on a promise to help China build the bomb, and, in 1960, withdrawing their thousands of advisors and experts almost overnight, taking their blueprints with them and leaving half-finished projects scattered across the country. The brotherhood that had seemed so warm a few years earlier collapsed into bitter rivalry, and the two largest communist powers on Earth became hostile competitors. The split was sealed when, in a border war between China and India in 1962, the Soviets sided with India rather than their supposed communist ally, a betrayal that confirmed in Mao's eyes that Moscow had abandoned the revolutionary cause entirely. That brief war was itself a revealing episode. Long simmering disputes over the exact line of the high Himalayan frontier, inflamed by the flight of the plateau's spiritual leader into India a few years earlier, erupted into open fighting in the autumn of 1962. The Chinese forces, well prepared and fighting in terrain they had carefully studied, swiftly overwhelmed the Indian positions and advanced with startling speed, inflicting a humiliating defeat. Then, having made its point and demonstrated its dominance, China did something that genuinely surprised the world. Rather than press its advantage and hold the captured ground, it unilaterally declared a ceasefire and withdrew its troops back roughly to where they had started, keeping only a portion of the disputed territory. It was a calculated display of strength followed by deliberate restraint, designed to teach a lesson rather than conquer land, and it left India shaken and the watching powers recalibrating their assessment of this isolated but evidently formidable nation. The bitterness over that frontier, however, never fully went away, and the disputed border would remain a source of tension between the two giant neighbours for generations. The rupture was not merely a falling out between two governments, but a struggle for the ideological leadership of the entire communist world. Mao now presented himself as the true keeper of the revolutionary flame, accusing the Soviets of having gone soft and sold out the global struggle, in exchange for a comfortable accommodation with the capitalist enemy. The two sides hurled lengthy and venomous ideological essays at each other, each claiming to represent authentic communism and denouncing the other as traitors and heretics, a doctrinal slugging match conducted with all the warmth of a particularly bitter divorce. Communist parties and movements around the world were forced to choose sides, splitting the global movement into rival camps. What had once been a unified bloc presenting a single face to the world was now a house divided against itself, and the enmity ran so deep that within a few years the two giants would be massing troops along their long shared frontier and edging toward open warfare. For China, the practical upshot was stark isolation. It was now at odds with the capitalist powers it had opposed since its founding, and equally at odds with the communist superpower that had been its chief patron and protector, leaving it to face a hostile world essentially alone. Amid all this upheaval came another crisis on the high plateau to the southwest, the region that had been brought under central control a few years earlier, under an uneasy arrangement preserving its traditional system. As we noted, that compromise was never going to hold, and in 1959 the simmering tensions finally erupted into a full uprising against the central government's tightening grip. The revolt was put down by force, and in its aftermath the region's revered spiritual and political leader, fearing for his safety, fled across the mountains into exile in neighbouring India, accompanied by tens of thousands of his followers, something like 80,000 people making the dangerous journey over the high passes. He would establish a government in exile abroad and become a globally recognised figure, while the region itself was brought firmly and permanently under direct central control. It was a confrontation whose echoes would persist for the rest of the century and beyond, and the leader's flight remains one of the era's defining images. Now here is where the story takes a turn that, against the grim backdrop of famine and diplomatic isolation, is genuinely remarkable. Cut off from Soviet help, embroiled in conflict with both superpowers, and recovering from a self-inflicted economic disaster, China made a fateful decision. Rather than abandoning its ambitions, it resolved to achieve the most advanced technology on Earth entirely on its own, relying on its own scientists, many of whom had been trained abroad and had returned out of patriotism to serve their country. The withdrawal of the Soviet experts, which might have killed the nuclear program in its cradle, instead became a point of fierce national pride and determination. If the friendly help would not come, China would simply build the bomb itself, thank you very much. To support this drive towards scientific self-reliance, the country invested in building up its scientific and educational institutions even in the midst of hardship, founding a major new university dedicated specifically to science and technology in 1958, intended to train the elite researchers and engineers the nation's ambitions would require. The contrast is striking. The same regime that had recently driven its intellectuals into the fields and presided over a catastrophic famine was simultaneously pouring resources into cutting-edge physics, channeling the talents of a remarkable cohort of brilliant scientists toward a single overriding goal. The story of these scientists is one of the more genuinely inspiring threads in this otherwise grim period. A number of the country's most gifted researchers had studied and worked in the West, building distinguished careers in the finest laboratories and universities abroad, and they chose to give all of that up and return home to a poor, isolated country to serve a cause they believed in. One of the most important figures in the rocket and missile program had been a leading aerospace scientist abroad before returning to lead China's efforts, bringing world-class expertise that no amount of money could otherwise have bought. These returnees worked under conditions of extreme secrecy and hardship, often in remote desert facilities, cut off from their families and forbidden to speak of their work, labouring with primitive equipment and hand calculations to solve problems that wealthier nations had cracked with vast resources and computers. That they succeeded at all, under a government that had so recently been melting cookware in the yard, is a testament to the sheer determination and talent of the people involved, working in circumstances that would have defeated most. It is one of those episodes where the human ingenuity on display almost makes you forget for a moment the catastrophe unfolding in the countryside around them. That goal was achieved in 1964 in a remote desert testing site in the far northwest, when China detonated its first atomic bomb. For a country that just a few years earlier had been melting down cooking pots in backyard furnaces, successfully mastering nuclear fission entirely on its own was an astonishing technical feat, and it announced to the world that China was a serious power that could not be ignored or bullied into submission. The achievement was so impressive that it forced a fundamental reassessment of the country's standing among the great powers, and the scientists did not stop there. Just 3 years later, in 1967, China successfully tested a vastly more powerful thermonuclear weapon, completing the leap from no nuclear capability at all to the most advanced kind in a span of time that stunned foreign observers and even outpaced the timeline of some of the established nuclear powers. With these tests, China joined the small and exclusive club of nations possessing the ultimate weapon, becoming the 5th nuclear power on the planet. The strategic meaning of this achievement was as important as the technical one. For more than a century, as the opening of this story made painfully clear, China had been bullied, invaded, and dictated to by stronger powers, and the memory of that humiliation drove much of what the leadership did. Possessing the bomb meant that, whatever else happened, the country could never again be threatened with annihilation, or coerced by the nuclear arsenals of the superpowers without the risk of devastating retaliation. It was an insurance policy written in the most terrible currency imaginable, and it fundamentally changed how the rest of the world had to treat the isolated nation. A country with nuclear weapons does not get pushed around in quite the same way, regardless of how poor or chaotic it might be at home, and China's leaders understood this perfectly. The bomb was, in a sense, the final answer to the century of weakness that had begun with foreign gunboats steaming up Chinese rivers, a guarantee that the era of being carved up by others was over for good. There is a profound and uncomfortable irony in all of this that captures the contradictions of the era perfectly. In the very same window of years, China managed to inflict upon itself one of the deadliest famines in human history, through breathtaking incompetence and ideological fanaticism, while simultaneously accomplishing one of the most impressive feats of independent scientific development the world had ever seen. The same system that could not reliably feed its own peasants could, when it focused its will and its best minds on a single concrete goal, produce a nuclear weapon from scratch under conditions of total isolation. It is a reminder that the story of this period resists simple summary, that catastrophe and achievement were often products of the very same forces of centralized power and mass mobilization, just pointed in different directions. By the middle of the 1960s, then, China stood in a peculiar and precarious position. It had survived a man-made famine of staggering proportions, pulled back from the brink under the steady hands of its pragmatic leaders, and clawed its way to the status of an independent nuclear power, all while standing utterly alone in the world, estranged from both the capitalist West and the communist bloc it had once belonged to. The economy was slowly healing, the pragmatists were quietly steering the country back towards something workable, and for a brief moment it might have seemed that the worst was over, and that calmer, more sensible governance was taking hold. But there was a problem with that comfortable assumption, and his name was Mao Zedong. The supreme leader had been pushed to the sidelines, watched his grand vision discredited, and seen power flow to the practical men who valued results over revolutionary fervour. He had not forgotten any of it, and he had not forgiven it. From his position in the shadows, the aging revolutionary was watching, brooding, and preparing to reclaim what he had lost, in the most spectacular and devastating way imaginable. A final convulsion that would tear the country apart all over again. The storm that Mao had been brewing in the shadows broke over China in 1966, and it would consume the next 10 years in a convulsion of chaos, fanaticism, and destruction, unlike almost anything in modern history. Having been sidelined after the famine and watched the practical men steer the country back towards stability and common sense, the aging leader concluded that his revolution was being smothered by exactly the kind of comfortable, bureaucratic, results-focused governance that the pragmatist represented. In his view, the country was sliding back toward the old ways, toward inequality and privilege and capitalism in disguise, and the people responsible were the very colleagues running the recovery. His solution was not to argue with them in committee meetings, which he would probably lose, but to go over their heads entirely and unleash the raw energy of the masses, and especially the young, against the party establishment itself. It was an almost unimaginable thing for the leader of a country to do, deliberately throwing his own state into turmoil to purge his rivals, and it worked terrifyingly well. The groundwork had been laid a couple of years earlier with the publication of a small book that would become one of the most printed objects in human history. It was a pocket-sized collection of several hundred quotations drawn from Mao's writings and speeches, bound in bright red covers, and it was promoted relentlessly until it became an almost sacred object. Over the following years, it was printed in quantities exceeding 1 billion copies, which made it, for a time, very likely the most widely distributed book on the planet after religious scripture. Carrying it, waving it, and quoting from it became a kind of devotional ritual and, more practically, a way of demonstrating one's loyalty and avoiding suspicion. There is something darkly absurd about a nation in which the safest accessory to be seen with was a particular little red book, but in the atmosphere taking shape, being caught without one was genuinely risky. In 1966, Mao gave the signal, calling on the youth of the country to rise up and attack the old order, summed up in a campaign to destroy what were branded the Four Olds, meaning old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits. Millions of students answered the call, organising themselves into militant bands that took the name Red Guards, and they threw themselves into the task with the boundless, frightening energy of young people who have suddenly been told that their elders are the enemy, and that smashing things is a revolutionary duty. What began as attacks on symbols of the old culture quickly escalated into something far darker. The Red Guards rampaged through cities destroying temples, artworks, books, and antiquities, ransacking homes, and turning on anyone deemed insufficiently revolutionary, including their own teachers, intellectuals, officials, and elderly people with the wrong family background. The signature ritual of this period was a public ordeal designed to humiliate and break its victims. People accused of being enemies of the revolution were dragged before jeering crowds, forced to bow in painful positions, made to wear dunce caps and placards listing their alleged crimes, and subjected to hours of screaming denunciation, beatings, and abuse. Teachers were tormented by their own students, children were pressured to denounce their parents, and lifelong friends turned on one another to prove their loyalty or simply to survive. The whole fabric of trust that holds a society together was deliberately shredded. It is difficult to convey how thoroughly normal life broke down, as schools closed, universities stopped functioning, and the ordinary business of a country gave way to a frenzy of accusation and violence. In 1967 alone, the bloodletting reached a horrifying scale, with the death toll from that single year running to something like 250,000 people, and that was only the beginning. The destruction of the old culture was carried out with a thoroughness that future generations would mourn. Ancient temples, shrines, and monuments that had survived centuries of war and dynastic collapse were smashed. Religious sites were desecrated, irreplaceable books and paintings were burned, and family heirlooms and antiques were destroyed as relics of a feudal past. Streets and shops were renamed with revolutionary slogans, traditional opera and literature were banned, and even certain hairstyles and clothing were treated as politically suspect. An enormous portion of the country's tangible cultural inheritance, the accumulated treasures of one of the oldest continuous civilizations on Earth, was deliberately obliterated in a matter of years, a cultural self-mutilation whose losses can never be recovered. Meanwhile, the worship of the leader reached a pitch that bordered on the religious. His portrait hung in every home and workplace. Citizens were expected to begin their day by reporting to it and to perform ritual gestures of devotion, and small metal badges bearing his image were produced and worn by the billions. People performed loyalty dances, recited his sayings before meals and tasks, and competed to demonstrate the purity of their devotion, since any sign of insufficient enthusiasm could mark a person as an enemy. It was a system in which adoration had become a survival strategy, and the line between genuine belief and terrified performance grew impossible to draw. A whole nation had been organized around the veneration of a single man, which is a precarious way to run anything, let alone a country of hundreds of millions. The campaign was orchestrated and amplified by figures around Mao who used it to advance their own power. The defense establishment, under a marshal who had been one of the brilliant commanders of the Civil War and was now Mao's closest ally and designated successor, threw the prestige and resources of the army behind the movement. Meanwhile, Mao's wife, a former actress with a fierce ideological streak and a long list of personal grievances, seized control of the cultural sphere, dictating what could be performed, published, and shown, and reducing the country's once rich artistic life to a handful of approved revolutionary works. Together with a small circle of radical allies, these figures became the engine of the chaos, directing the storm against their enemies while wrapping themselves in the mantle of Mao's authority. The pragmatic leaders who had cleaned up after the famine were the primary targets, and their fates were grim. The methodical organization man who had been Mao's own designated heir, the very figure who had dared to describe the Great Campaign as a human-made disaster, was now denounced as the country's leading traitor, stripped of all his positions, brutally persecuted, and left to die, neglected and alone, in detention in 1969. It was a stunning fall for a man who had been the second most powerful person in the country, and it sent an unmistakable message that no one, however senior, was safe. The tough little enforcer from the earlier purges fared somewhat better, in that he survived, but he too was disgraced, stripped of his offices and sent away from the capital to perform manual labour at a remote factory, his career apparently over. The persecution extended cruelly to his family, and his son was left permanently disabled after an encounter with Red Guards, a personal tragedy that the father reportedly never forgot. That this purged and humiliated man would one day return to remake the entire country is one of the great improbabilities of the whole story. But for now he was simply another casualty of the madness. The violence did not confine itself to famous leaders. A vast campaign launched in 1968, ostensibly to root out hidden class enemies and traitors lurking within the population, swept across the country and ground up enormous numbers of ordinary people, with the toll of those persecuted, imprisoned and killed running into the tens of millions when all its phases are counted. Entire categories of people were targeted on the basis of their family background, their education, or some careless remark, and the machinery of accusation, once set in motion, devoured the innocent and the loyal, alongside any genuine opponents. It was a society turning on itself with a ferocity that, even decades later, the country has found difficult to fully reckon with. Eventually, even Mao recognized that the chaos he had unleashed was spinning beyond anyone's control, with rival factions of Red Guards fighting pitched battles in the streets and the country sliding toward anarchy. To restore order, he turned to the army, sending soldiers to suppress the very youth movement he had called into being, and dispatching millions of urban young people to the countryside to learn from the peasants, a convenient way of scattering the troublemakers far from the cities where they had caused so much trouble. A generation of students who had been encouraged to abandon their studies and smash the old world now found themselves shipped off to remote villages to do hard agricultural labour for years, their educations interrupted and their prospects shattered. They are sometimes called the lost generation, and the name is well earned. The toll on the country went far beyond the human suffering and the cultural destruction, devastating as those were. For a decade, the institutions a modern nation depends on were either paralysed or actively dismantled. With universities shuttered and intellectuals persecuted, the training of a new generation of doctors, engineers, scientists and teachers ground nearly to a halt, opening a gap in the country's expertise that would take years to repair. Factories were disrupted by political struggle, management was attacked as bourgeois, production was hobbled by the elevation of revolutionary fervour over technical competence, and the economy stagnated while the rest of the region, including the rival island across the strait, surged ahead. Governance itself broke down as experienced administrators were purged and replaced by committees chosen for their political reliability, rather than any ability to actually run things. By the time the madness subsided, China had not only suffered immense human loss, but had also fallen years further behind the modern world it so badly wanted to catch, squandering a decade that its neighbours had spent growing rich. It is a sobering thought that the country inflicted upon itself, with no help from any foreign enemy, a setback as severe as a major war. The most spectacular twist in the whole drama involved Mao's own chosen successor, the defence chief who had done so much to power the movement. The relationship between the two men soured, amid mutual suspicion and a struggle over the succession, and in 1971 the affair reached an end so bizarre it would strain credulity in a work of fiction. According to the official account, the would-be heir, having allegedly plotted against Mao and fearing exposure, attempted to flee the country by air, and his plane crashed in the deserts of the neighbouring country to the north, killing everyone aboard. The man Mao had publicly anointed as his closest comrade and successor, whose name had been written into the party's own constitution, was now declared a traitor who had died fleeing toward the hated Soviet enemy. For ordinary people who had spent years chanting this man's praises alongside Mao's, the news was deeply disorienting, and it badly damaged the credibility of the whole revolutionary mythology. If the great leader's hand-picked successor was secretly a traitor, what exactly was anyone supposed to believe? While the country tore itself apart at home, something remarkable was happening in its relations with the outside world, driven by the cold logic of the split with the Soviet Union. That estrangement, which we traced earlier, had curdled into outright hostility, and in 1969 the two communist giants actually fought a series of bloody clashes along their disputed frontier, bringing them to the brink of full-scale war and even raising the spectre of a nuclear exchange. Facing this terrifying prospect, both China and the United States, longtime enemies, began to recognize that they shared a common adversary in Moscow, and that the old saying about the enemy of my enemy might have something to it. The thaw began with one of the more charming episodes in the history of diplomacy. In 1971, an American table tennis team competing in Japan received a surprise invitation to visit China, and this small, friendly exchange of athletes, dubbed ping-pong diplomacy, served as a gentle public signal that the frozen relationship might be ready to warm. It is a pleasant irony that the great geopolitical realignment of the era was eased into motion by a sport best known for being played in suburban basements. The athletic icebreaker was followed by serious secret negotiations, and the breakthroughs came quickly. In October of 1971, the international community voted to give China's seat at the World Organization, including the coveted permanent seat on its powerful Security Council, to the communist government on the mainland rather than the rival government on the island, which had held it until then. After decades of isolation, the People's Republic was finally recognized as the legitimate representative of China on the world stage. The capstone came in 1972, when the American president, a fierce anti-communist of all people, made a historic visit to China and met with Mao himself, an encounter that would have seemed utterly impossible only a few years earlier. The visit, splashed across television screens around the world, dramatically ended China's isolation from the West, began the lifting of the long economic embargo, and reset the global balance of power. There is a certain wry humour in watching two governments that had spent decades denouncing each other as the embodiment of evil suddenly discover, with great mutual courtesy, that they had so much to talk about, but such are the workings of strategic necessity. China had broken out of its isolation without abandoning a word of its revolutionary rhetoric, which was quite a trick. The two sides papered over their enormous differences with a carefully worded joint statement that managed to acknowledge their disagreements while committing to improved relations, a diplomatic balancing act that hinged above all on the delicate question of the island across the strait. The mainland insisted that there was only one China, and that the island was part of it, and the Americans, eager for the relationship, acknowledged this position with deliberately ambiguous language, while continuing in practice to support the island's security. This studied vagueness about the most sensitive issue in the relationship would become the foundation of the awkward but durable arrangement between the two powers for decades to come, a masterpiece of saying just enough to move forward while leaving the hardest question unresolved. Full diplomatic recognition would come a few years later, at which point the United States formally switched its recognition from the island government to the mainland, a heavy diplomatic blow to the former that we will return to shortly. For now, the essential point is that the mainland had transformed its position in the world even as it remained in turmoil at home, trading decades of isolation for a seat at the centre of global affairs. By the mid-1970s, the Great Convulsion was winding down, but the era did not end quietly. The country's revered premier, the smooth and tireless diplomat who had managed to survive at the top through every upheaval and who had quietly protected many people and institutions from the worst of the chaos, died of cancer in January of 1976. He was deeply beloved, seen by many as a moderating influence and a decent man amid the fanaticism, and his death prompted an enormous outpouring of public grief. That spring, when crowds gathered in the great square in the capital to mourn him and to lay wreaths in his honour, the gatherings took on an unmistakable political edge, becoming a veiled protest against the radicals and the madness of the preceding years. The authorities, recognising the threat, sent forces to clear the square and disperse the mourners, and the radicals seized the moment to once again purge the recently rehabilitated pragmatic leader, who was blamed for the disturbance and stripped of his positions for a second time. He must have been getting rather used to it by then. Then, in September of 1976, the man who had dominated the country for a quarter of a century finally died. Mao Zedong's death at last removed the towering figure around whom everything had revolved, and it instantly opened a furious struggle over what would come next. The radical clique that had ridden the chaos to power, led by Mao's widow and 3 of her closest allies, hoped to inherit his mantle and continue the revolutionary line. But they had made many enemies and commanded little genuine loyalty outside their own circle, and within a single month their gamble collapsed. Mao's chosen interim successor, a relatively colourless compromise figure, moved against them decisively, and in October of 1976 he had the 4 radical leaders arrested in a swift, bloodless stroke. Branded the Gang of Four and blamed for the worst excesses of the preceding decade, they became the convenient scapegoats for a national trauma that had, in truth, far deeper roots. With their arrest, the curtain finally came down on the era, and an exhausted, traumatized nation could begin, cautiously, to imagine a different future. The death toll of the whole period is impossible to fix precisely, but it ran well into the millions, and the damage to the country's institutions, its culture, its economy, and its trust in itself was incalculable. While the mainland had spent these decades lurching from one self-inflicted catastrophe to the next, it is worth remembering that there was, all this time, another China, and its story unfolded along a startlingly different path on the far side of the strait. To understand what the mainland's choices truly cost, and to glimpse what might have been, we have to rewind the clock and follow the defeated side of the Civil War to the island where it made its last stand. When the Generalissimo retreated across the water in 1949 with the remnants of his government and army, as we saw at the close of the Civil War, he arrived on an island that was hardly a blank slate. It had been a colony of the Japanese Empire for half a century, and the relationship between the newly arrived mainlanders and the long-time local population was tense from the start. In fact, that tension had already exploded into tragedy a couple of years earlier, in early 1947, when local resentment against the corrupt and heavy-handed administration of the incoming authorities boiled over into an uprising. The response was a brutal crackdown in which the authorities killed many thousands of people, including a large portion of the island's educated local elite, in an event that left a deep and lasting scar on the population and poisoned relations between the two communities for generations. It was a grim opening chapter for the island's new rulers, and a reminder that the defeated nationalists had brought their authoritarian habits across the water with them. This founding trauma hardened into a lasting social divide that would shape the island's politics for decades. On one side were the roughly 2 million mainlanders who had fled across the strait with the defeated government, who dominated the military, the bureaucracy, and the upper reaches of the ruling party. On the other was the much larger population of islanders whose families had lived there for generations, many of whom spoke a different dialect and had been shut out of power by the newcomers. The government, clinging to its claim to rule all of China, maintained the elaborate fiction that the legislators elected on the mainland back in the 1940s remained the rightful representatives of the whole country, which meant that for decades aging politicians supposedly representing mainland provinces they could not visit kept their seats without facing the voters, an arrangement that grew more surreal with every passing year. The whole apparatus of the state was organised around the promise of an eventual return to the mainland, a promise that receded further into fantasy with each decade, but that justified the continued grip of the mainlander minority on power. Reconciling these two communities and gradually handing power to the island's own people would become one of the central dramas of its later transformation. Once firmly established, the Generalissimo governed the island as a stern one-party state, maintaining that his regime remained the only legitimate government of all China, and that the loss of the mainland was a temporary setback to be reversed. To enforce this fiction, and to guard against communist infiltration, the government imposed martial law in 1949, and it would remain in force for an astonishing length of time, becoming one of the longest periods of martial law anywhere in the world. Under its cover, the authorities conducted a prolonged campaign of political repression against suspected communists, dissidents, and anyone deemed a threat, an era of fear remembered as the White Terror, during which tens of thousands of people were imprisoned and many were executed or simply disappeared. Political opposition was banned, the press was censored, and the island lived for decades under tight authoritarian control. So far, this might sound depressingly familiar, a smaller mirror of the repression on the mainland. But here the two stories diverge in a way that is genuinely illuminating, because in the economic sphere the island's rulers got crucial things right, where the mainland had gone catastrophically wrong. Take the question of land, which had caused such bloodshed and such famine across the water. The island's government carried out its own land reform, but it did so without the mass killings and the chaos that had marked the mainland's approach. Through a phased and relatively orderly program, it first reduced the rents that tenant farmers had to pay, then sold government-held land to the people who farmed it, and finally compelled large landowners to sell their excess land to their tenants in exchange for bonds and shares in state enterprises. The result was that the former landlords were compensated and gently nudged into becoming industrialists, while a broad class of small farmers gained ownership of their land and a powerful incentive to produce. It accomplished the same goal the mainland had pursued, redistributing land to the tillers, but through purchase and policy rather than struggle sessions and executions, and it laid a stable foundation for everything that followed. It turns out you can give peasants their land without holding a single denunciation rally, which the mainland might have found instructive. Backed by substantial American economic and military aid, motivated by the strategic value of keeping the island out of communist hands, the government then presided over one of the most remarkable economic transformations of the 20th century. Starting from a poor agricultural base, the island shifted first into light industry and labour-intensive manufacturing, churning out textiles, toys and household goods for export, and then steadily climbed the ladder toward more sophisticated products like electronics and machinery. Decade after decade, the economy grew at a blistering pace. Incomes rose, education spread, and a poor island colony transformed itself into a prosperous, modern, industrialized society. This astonishing success earned the island a place among a celebrated group of fast-growing East Asian economies, often called the Asian Tigers, and the transformation came to be known as an economic miracle. The contrast could hardly have been starker. While the mainland was melting its cookware and tearing itself apart in ideological frenzy, the rival China across the strait was quietly building one of the great economic success stories of the age. This economic strength turned out to be fortunate, because the island was about to suffer a series of crushing diplomatic defeats. Having lost its seat at the World Organization, as we saw, it then watched its most important ally formally switch recognition to the mainland at the end of the 1970s, breaking off official diplomatic ties and ending the formal alliance, though the Americans quietly arranged to keep supplying the island with defensive weapons and maintained unofficial relations. One by one, the countries of the world transferred their recognition to the mainland, until the island found itself diplomatically isolated, recognized officially by only a dwindling handful of small nations, and excluded from most international bodies. It was a bitter pill for a government that still styled itself the legitimate ruler of all China, and yet, remarkably, the island did not collapse under this isolation. Its booming economy gave it a different kind of power, the leverage of trade, investment, and indispensable industries, which meant that countries which would not recognize it diplomatically were nonetheless eager to do business with it. The island had discovered that economic weight could substitute, at least partly, for the formal recognition it had lost, a lesson in the modern sources of national strength. The Generalissimo died in 1975, never having returned to the mainland he had vowed to reconquer, and power passed to his son, who had spent years as his father's enforcer and security chief, but who would, somewhat unexpectedly, prove to be a far more consequential and ultimately more liberal figure than his stern parent. When the mainland's new paramount leader, having returned from disgrace, later proposed reuniting the two sides under a formula that promised the island a high degree of autonomy while accepting the mainland's sovereignty, a model summed up as one country with two systems. The son firmly rejected it, unwilling to surrender the island's separate existence and hard-won prosperity to the very party his father had spent his life fighting. Instead, the son set the island on a path that ran in exactly the opposite direction from the mainland, toward openness rather than tighter control. In a series of momentous decisions late in his life, he began dismantling the very authoritarian apparatus his family had built. In 1987, he lifted the decades-long martial law, ending one of the longest such states of emergency in history and opening the door to genuine political freedom. He legalized opposition parties and relaxed censorship, deliberately steering his one-party state toward democracy. The process he began continued after his death and gathered remarkable speed. The island held its first full, freely contested parliamentary elections in the early 1990s, and then, in 1996, it achieved a milestone that the mainland has never approached, holding its first direct popular election for its top leader, in which ordinary citizens chose their president at the ballot box. A society that had lived for decades under martial law had peacefully transformed itself into a vibrant multi-party democracy, all without the bloodshed and upheaval that had so often accompanied political change across the water. The symbolism of who led that final transition was striking. The man who carried the democratization forward after the old leader's son passed away was himself a member of the island's native-born majority, rather than the mainlander elite that had ruled for so long, the first person from that long-excluded community to hold the top office. His eventual victory in a direct popular election represented not just the triumph of democracy, but the passing of real power to the island's own people, closing the wound that had been opened by the violence of the late 1940s. That a one-party state founded by a defeated generalissimo could evolve, within a single lifetime, into a genuine democracy led by a member of the very population it had once suppressed, is a quietly extraordinary thing, and it stands in pointed contrast to the path the mainland chose. The transformation was not perfect, and the old divisions did not vanish, but the ballot box had replaced the secret police as the arbiter of power, which is no small achievement for any society. There was one more piece of the island's transformation that would, in time, give it a significance out of all proportion to its size, and it concerned a humble-sounding industry. In 1987, the same eventful year that martial law was lifted, a new company was founded on the island with a novel business idea, focusing not on designing its own products, but on manufacturing semiconductor chips to order for other companies that designed them. This contract chip-making model proved spectacularly successful, and over the following decades that company grew into the largest and most advanced producer of semiconductors in the world, the indispensable manufacturer of the tiny chips that power virtually every modern electronic device, from phones to cars to weapon systems. An island that had begun as a refuge for a defeated army ended up holding one of the most strategically vital industries on the planet in the palm of its hand, a development that would place it at the very centre of global tensions in the century to come. The story of the island serves as a kind of mirror held up to the mainland, and the reflection is a provocative one. Here were two Chinese societies sprung from the same civilization, the same language, and the same century of humiliation, divided by a civil war and then sent down utterly different roads. One pursued revolution, mass mobilization, and the violent remaking of society, and paid for it with famine and chaos and tens of millions of lives. The other, for all its early repression, embraced markets, education, and gradual reform, and grew rich and eventually free. The comparison does not prove any simple lesson, since the two faced very different circumstances and the island had advantages the mainland did not, but it raises an unavoidable question about the roads not taken, and it sets the stage for the final act of our story, because the mainland was about to attempt, under new leadership, a transformation of its own that would draw, whether it admitted it or not, on some of the very lessons its rival across the water had been quietly teaching all along. The man who would lead that transformation was someone we have already met more than once, and his survival to this point was itself a small miracle. Twice purged, twice humiliated, sent off to labour in a tractor factory, and to mourn a son maimed by the chaos, the tough, diminutive veteran with the famously practical streak had outlasted them all. After the death of the great helmsman and the fall of the radical clique, the colourless compromise figure left in charge proved no match for him, and within about 2 years the survivor had outmanoeuvred his way to the top. By 1978, Deng Xiaoping was the paramount leader of China, though characteristically he never bothered to take the grandest official titles, preferring to wield real power from more modest positions. He had learned, perhaps better than anyone, that titles are decorative and that actual authority is what counts. Deng had drawn one overwhelming lesson from the catastrophes of the preceding decades, the famine and the chaos he had witnessed and suffered through, and it was this. Endless ideological campaigns and revolutionary fervour had nearly destroyed the country, while what people actually needed was to be fed, housed, educated, and allowed to prosper. His guiding philosophy was relentlessly practical, captured in that earlier remark about the colour of the cat mattering less than whether it caught mice, a sentiment that now became something close to national policy. He announced a sweeping programme built around modernising 4 key areas of national life: agriculture, industry, defence, and science and technology, and he wrapped the whole project in a wonderfully flexible phrase, declaring that China was building socialism with its own distinct characteristics. This formulation was a masterstroke of political language, because it allowed the country to introduce market mechanisms, private enterprise, and foreign investment, all things that looked an awful lot like capitalism, while still calling the whole thing socialism. If anyone objected that this looked suspiciously like abandoning communist principles, the answer was simply that it had Chinese characteristics, which conveniently meant whatever the leadership needed it to mean. Deng's genius, if that is the word, lay in his caution as much as his boldness. Unlike his predecessor, who had tried to leap to utopia in a single bound and brought catastrophe, Deng favoured a careful, experimental, step-by-step approach, famously likening reform to crossing a river by feeling for the stones underfoot one at a time. Policies were tried out in limited areas first, and if they worked, they were expanded, and if they failed, they could be quietly abandoned before doing nationwide damage. This pragmatic trial-and-error method stood in deliberate contrast to the grand all-or-nothing campaigns of the past, and it was precisely this willingness to test, observe, and adjust, rather than to impose a single sweeping blueprint by force of will, that allowed the reforms to succeed where so many earlier schemes had ended in disaster. After decades of leaders insisting they held the one true answer, here at last was a leader whose central insight was that nobody really knew the answer, and that the sensible thing was to find out by trying. It is important to understand, however, that Deng's pragmatism had a very firm limit, and he drew the line with absolute clarity. Economic freedom was on offer. Political freedom was emphatically not. In 1979, he laid down a set of fundamental principles that were declared non-negotiable, chief among them the unchallengeable leadership of the Communist Party. The message was that the country could experiment freely with how to grow its economy, but the party's monopoly on power was permanent and beyond debate. This was no idle warning. Around the same time, a brief flowering of public political expression had appeared in the capital, where ordinary citizens posted essays and criticisms on a particular city wall, openly discussing democracy and reform in a way that had been unthinkable for years. One bold young electrician wrote an essay arguing that the 4 modernizations would mean nothing without a 5th, namely democracy, pointing out the obvious truth that economic progress under an unaccountable government was a precarious thing. For this act of clear-eyed candour he was arrested and sentenced to many years in prison, and the wall was shut down. The lesson, familiar by now, was reaffirmed in concrete. You could get rich, but you could not ask who was in charge. With the political boundaries firmly fixed, Deng unleashed an economic revolution that would change the lives of more people, more quickly than perhaps any policy in human history. He started in the countryside, where the disastrous communes were finally and fully dismantled. Land was returned to individual family management under a system that let households farm their own plots and, after meeting a quota sold to the state, keep or sell whatever surplus they produced. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Freed to profit from their own labour, peasants who had languished under collective farming suddenly had every reason to work hard and grow more, and agricultural output leapt upward, rising by well over half in just a few years. It was the clearest possible demonstration of a lesson the country had learned the hardest way imaginable, that people tend to grow more food when they get to keep it, a principle that really should not have required tens of millions of deaths to establish. But there we are. The reform that unlocked all this had a wonderfully human origin story. In one poor village, a group of desperate farmers, exhausted by years of collective failure and chronic hunger, secretly agreed among themselves to divide the collective land into family plots and farm it individually, each household keeping what it produced beyond the state quota. They knew this was strictly forbidden and potentially dangerous, so they signed a secret pact, reportedly pressing their fingerprints to it, and even agreed to raise one another's children if any of them were imprisoned or executed for the scheme. The arrangement was so successful that their harvest that year dwarfed anything the village had managed under collective farming, and rather than punishing them, the reformist leadership quietly recognized that the peasants had stumbled onto exactly the answer the country needed. What had been a forbidden conspiracy became national policy, which is a rather charming example of a government having the good sense to follow its own people, rather than the other way around. Alongside this, rural areas were allowed to set up small enterprises producing all manner of goods, and these village and township businesses sprang up by the millions, absorbing surplus rural labour and forming one of the earliest engines of the boom. Then came the truly audacious step, the deliberate creation of windows onto the capitalist world. Deng designated several coastal areas as special economic zones, places where the normal rules of the socialist economy were suspended, and foreign companies were invited to set up factories, bring in capital and technology, and operate with low taxes and few restrictions, all to produce goods for export. The most famous of these was a sleepy fishing town near the border with the prosperous British-run port, a place of rice paddies and modest villages that was selected to become a laboratory for the new economics. Within a single generation, that fishing town exploded into a glittering megacity of skyscrapers and factories, and many millions of people, becoming a global symbol of the country's breakneck transformation. The contrast between what that place had been and what it became in a couple of decades is so extreme that it functions almost as a parable, the speed of Chinese development compressed into the skyline of a single city. It was not the only such experiment. Other coastal cities were designated as zones too, including a southeastern port chosen partly for its proximity and historic ties to the prosperous Chinese communities across the strait and overseas, and over time the whole eastern seaboard was progressively open to foreign trade and investment. The transition was not smooth, and it bred some genuinely thorny problems. For a period, the economy ran on a peculiar dual system in which the same goods had one price fixed by the state and another set by the market, an arrangement that all but invited well-connected officials and their relatives to buy cheap at the official price and sell dear at the market price, pocketing the difference. This kind of profiteering, along with the inflation that accompanied the rapid changes, fueled exactly the popular resentment over corruption and unfairness that would help drive people into the streets at the end of the decade. Reform, it turned out, created winners and losers, and the perception that the winners were too often the privileged and the well-connected rather than the deserving and the hard-working became a dangerous source of anger. The reforms reached into every corner of national life. The universities and schools that had been shuttered and gutted during the years of chaos were reopened, and the competitive examination that channeled students into higher education was restored, giving a battered generation a path back toward knowledge and opportunity, and beginning to repair the enormous gap in trained expertise that the lost decade had torn open. Intellectuals and experts were rehabilitated and put back to work, foreign books and ideas began to flow in again, and a society that had been told for years to distrust learning was cautiously encouraged to value it once more. Not every policy of this era was a story of liberation, and one in particular cast a long shadow that would stretch into the present. Worried that the country's enormous and still growing population would devour the gains of economic development before they could take hold, the leadership introduced in 1980 a strict limit on family size, the famous policy that restricted most couples to having only a single child. Enforced through a vast and sometimes coercive bureaucracy of incentives, fines, and pressure, the policy did slow population growth dramatically, but at an enormous human and social cost, and it produced a set of long-term consequences, an aging population, and a skewed balance of the sexes among them that the country is still grappling with today. It was a sweeping attempt to engineer the most intimate decisions of hundreds of millions of families by decree, and like so many such attempts in this story, it achieved its narrow goal while generating problems its planners had not fully foreseen, a recurring pattern in a century full of grand plans that worked exactly as intended right up until they did not. For about a decade, the reforms surged forward and the economy boomed. But the fundamental tension Deng had built into his system, economic openness paired with political rigidity, could not be suppressed forever. And in 1989 it erupted into the gravest crisis the regime had faced since taking power. The rapid changes had brought not only prosperity but also inflation, corruption, and a growing appetite, especially among students and intellectuals, for the political reform that had been so firmly forbidden. The spark was the death in the spring of 1989 of a senior reformist leader who had been popular among students and had earlier been pushed out for being too liberal. As had happened once before with a beloved premier, public mourning for him swelled into something far larger and more political. Students and citizens poured into the vast central square in the heart of the capital, the symbolic centre of the nation, and what began as mourning grew into an enormous sustained demonstration calling for democracy, press freedom, and an end to corruption. The protesters occupied the square for weeks, some launching a dramatic hunger strike that won broad public sympathy, and the movement spread to cities across the country. For a tense and electric period, with the eyes of the world watching, it seemed as though China might be approaching a genuine turning point. The leadership was divided over how to respond, with some favouring dialogue and concession, and others demanding a hard line. In the end, the hardliners prevailed. Martial law was declared, and in the early hours of the 4th of June, the army was sent in to clear the square and the surrounding streets by force. The crackdown was deadly, and the true number of those killed has never been reliably established, in part because the government has worked diligently ever since to erase the event from public memory. The official figure acknowledged a couple of hundred civilian deaths, while credible outside estimates run considerably higher, very possibly into the thousands. The episode produced one of the most enduring images of the entire century, when a lone, unarmed man in a white shirt, carrying what appeared to be shopping bags, planted himself in front of a column of advancing tanks and refused to move, halting the armoured vehicles through nothing but the moral weight of his own body. His identity and his ultimate fate remain unknown, but the photograph of that solitary figure facing down a line of tanks became a global symbol of individual courage against overwhelming power, even as it was rigorously censored within the country itself. The consequence abroad was immediate. Western governments imposed sanctions, the warm relationships of the previous years cooled sharply, and China found itself, once again, isolated and condemned. The crisis also reshaped the leadership itself. The party's top official at the time, a reform-minded figure who had favoured dialogue with the demonstrators and had even gone, visibly emotional, to plead with the hunger strikers in the square, was blamed for the turmoil and stripped of his power, spending the remainder of his long life under house arrest, his name quietly erased from public discussion. His fall sent an unmistakable signal about which way the wind now blew. In the aftermath, the leadership tightened political controls, intensified ideological education, and made clear that the boundary Deng had drawn a decade earlier, economic opening without political loosening, was now etched in stone and reinforced with concrete. The implicit bargain offered to the population in the years that followed was blunt and, for a time, broadly accepted, that the party would deliver rising prosperity and national strength, and in return the people would leave politics to the party. Stability and growth were the promise. Questions about who ruled were off the table. For a couple of years afterward, the reform programme itself seemed to stall, as conservatives within the leadership used the crisis to argue that opening up had gone too far and bred dangerous instability. The economic experiment hung in the balance, and it might have been rolled back entirely. That it was not is due largely to a single dramatic intervention by the ageing paramount leader, by then officially retired but still wielding immense personal authority. Early in 1992, Deng undertook a celebrated journey to the booming southern coast, including that transformed fishing town turned metropolis, and at each stop he loudly and pointedly praised the results of economic reform, warning against the dangers of conservatism and insisting that opening up and getting rich was the correct path and must continue and even accelerate. This southern tour, as it became known, was essentially an elder statesman using his prestige to overrule the doubters and relaunch the entire reform project, and it worked. The leadership fell back into line behind accelerated reform, and the country formally embraced what it called a socialist market economy, a phrase that finally made more or less explicit what had been true for years, that China was building a market economy while keeping the political label of socialism firmly attached. The deepening of reform in the 1990s required tackling something that earlier rounds had largely left alone: the vast and inefficient sector of state-owned factories and enterprises that employed huge numbers of people under a system of guaranteed lifetime jobs, housing, and benefits, an arrangement affectionately and accurately known as the Iron Rice Bowl. Many of these enterprises lost money year after year and survived only on state support, and the leadership concluded that the country could not modernize while propping them all up. So in a painful and politically risky push, the government restructured, merged, or shut down enormous numbers of these state firms, laying off tens of millions of workers whose cradle-to-grave security suddenly evaporated. It was a wrenching transition that caused real hardship and resentment among a generation of workers who had been promised security for life, and it shattered the old socialist bargain in the name of efficiency. The bet was that a leaner, more competitive economy would generate enough new jobs and wealth to more than compensate, and broadly speaking, over time it did, though that was cold comfort to those caught in the middle of the upheaval. What followed was the greatest sustained economic expansion the world has ever seen, and its human consequences were staggering in the best possible way. Over the course of roughly 3 decades, the proportion of the population living in extreme poverty fell from a crushing majority, well over 80%, to something approaching zero. Hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of the kind of grinding destitution that had defined Chinese rural life for centuries, in what amounts to the largest and fastest reduction of poverty in recorded history, an accomplishment that even the country's harshest critics struggle to wave away. Cities sprouted, factories multiplied, incomes soared, and a country that had recently been melting its cooking pots became the workshop of the world, manufacturing a vast share of the goods that filled stores across the planet. It was an achievement of genuine and almost incomprehensible scale, and it deserves to be recognized as such. But it would be dishonest to tell this story as an unqualified triumph, because the breakneck growth came with very real costs that the country still carries. The benefits were spread enormously unevenly, opening a vast gulf between the prosperous coastal cities and the still poor rural interior, and between a new wealthy class and the workers whose labour powered the boom. The old household registration system, which we discussed earlier, meant that the hundreds of millions of rural migrants who flooded into the cities to build them and work in their factories were often denied equal access to schooling, healthcare, and services in the very places they lived and worked, creating a kind of permanent underclass of internal migrants. And the environmental price was severe, as decades of furious industrialization left the air of many cities thick with smog, the rivers polluted and the land scarred, problems serious enough to shorten lives and that the country would eventually have to spend enormous sums trying to undo. Rapid development, it turns out, sends an invoice, and China is still paying it. A defining feature of this growth, beyond the factories and exports, was building on a scale the world had never witnessed. The country poured staggering resources into infrastructure, throwing up highways, bridges, airports, ports, power plants, and entire new districts at a pace that left foreign visitors slack-jawed. Most spectacularly, it constructed from scratch the largest network of high-speed railways on the planet, knitting distant cities together with trains that glided along at remarkable speeds, a system built in a couple of decades that dwarfed what older industrial nations had managed in far longer. There is a standing joke that the country poured more concrete in a few years than some nations had used in their entire histories, and while the figure varies in the telling, the underlying truth is real and astonishing. This construction frenzy created jobs, connected markets, and modernized the country at breakneck speed, though it also sometimes produced gleaming new districts with too few occupants and a mountain of debt, a reminder that building furiously is not quite the same as building wisely. Still, the physical transformation of the country was undeniable, and anyone returning after a decade away could be forgiven for wondering whether they had landed in the right place. The architect of all this did not live to see its full flowering. Deng died in 1997, having transformed his country more profoundly than almost any leader of the century, and power passed smoothly for once to a chosen successor, a transition that itself marked how far the country had come from the murderous succession struggles of the past. His legacy is a genuinely complicated one, and it resists the simple verdicts that people often want from history. This was the man who lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty and opened his country to the world, and also the man who locked in one-party rule and gave the final order that cleared the square in the capital. He was neither the saint his admirers sometimes paint, nor the villain his critics prefer, but something more interesting and more human. A pragmatist scarred by decades of upheaval, who concluded that prosperity mattered more than ideology, and that stability mattered more than freedom, and who pursued that conviction with both remarkable results and a hard, unsentimental ruthlessness. Reasonable people weigh those achievements and those costs very differently, and they probably always will. What is beyond dispute is the sheer scale of what changed under his direction, the transformation of the lives of roughly a fifth of all the human beings on the planet, which is not a sentence one gets to write about many individuals. That successor presided over a series of milestones that announced China's return to the front rank of nations. That same year, the prosperous British-run port that had been ceded away at the very beginning of this whole story, back when foreign gunboats first humbled the empire, was finally returned to Chinese sovereignty, handed over under that formula promising it a high degree of autonomy for 50 years. The neighbouring port, long held by another European power, followed a couple of years later. There was a powerful symmetry in this that would not have been lost on anyone who knew the history. The island and harbour in question had been the very first prize surrendered in that humiliating treaty, more than a century and a half earlier, the opening wound of the whole era of foreign domination. To take it back, peacefully, and on the strength of the country's revived power, was to close the circle that had opened with that first defeat. The handover ceremony, conducted at midnight with great pomp, as one flag came down and another rose, was staged with deliberate emotional weight as a moment of national redemption. The autonomy formula, the same one the island across the strait had earlier rejected, was now put into practice in the returned port, which kept its own legal system, its freewheeling capitalist economy, and many of its liberties, at least for the time being. Whether that promise of a separate system would endure for its full term was a question for the future, but for the moment the return of the lost territories felt like the symbolic healing of the original injury. After a century and a half, the most symbolic wounds of the era of humiliation were being stitched closed, and the bookend was deliberate and deeply felt. The momentum only built from there. In 2001, after years of difficult negotiation and hard-won concessions on all sides, China joined the global body governing world trade, formally integrating itself into the international economic system and supercharging its already roaring export machine until it became the largest exporter of goods on the planet. The country that had once been forced at gunpoint to open a handful of ports to foreign trade was now, on its own terms, the indispensable hub of global manufacturing. The human engine behind this manufacturing miracle deserves a mention because it was powered by one of the largest movements of people in human history. Hundreds of millions of rural workers left their villages and streamed into the booming coastal cities to labour in the factories that churned out the world's goods, an internal migration so vast it dwarfs most of the famous migrations of the past. These migrant workers built the skyscrapers, assembled the electronics, and stitched the clothing that filled shops on every continent, often working punishing hours far from their families and, as noted earlier, frequently without full access to the services of the cities they were building. They were the unsung foundation of the entire boom, and their sweat is woven into more of the objects in a typical modern home than most people ever stop to consider. Meanwhile, the country was also reaching upward, and in 2003 it launched its first astronaut into orbit, becoming only the third nation ever to send a human into space using its own technology, a feat that planted the flag of Chinese capability in yet another domain once reserved for the superpowers. The same drive for self-reliant mastery that had produced the bomb decades earlier was now reaching for the stars. Then, in 2008, the capital hosted a spectacular international sporting festival, an event staged with breathtaking grandeur and intended as a coming-out party to announce to the world that China had arrived as a confident, modern and powerful nation. The message was received, and the following year, in 2009, China passed a milestone that brings this entire long journey full circle, overtaking its old rival and former tormentor across the Eastern Sea to become the second largest economy on Earth, trailing only the United States. The timing of that ascent carried its own significance. That same year that the capital dazzled the world with its games, a financial crisis erupted in the West and spread into a global downturn that battered the established economies. China, by contrast, responded with an enormous burst of government spending and lending that kept its own economy growing briskly, while much of the rich world stagnated, and the contrast was not lost on anyone. To many observers, the crisis seemed to mark a shifting of the global balance, with the long-dominant Western economies stumbling just as China surged confidently past one milestone after another. The mood within the country grew correspondingly more assured, even assertive, as the long century of humiliation receded further into the past, and a new sense of national confidence, sometimes shading into pride and ambition, took its place. The overtaking of its eastern neighbour to claim the rank of second-largest economy was, in this light, less a surprise than a confirmation of a trajectory that now seemed unstoppable. Pause on that for a moment, because it is the whole point. We began this story with a colossus brought to its knees, the richest and most populous realm on Earth reduced over a single brutal century to a carved-up, impoverished, war-ravaged shadow of itself, mocked as the sick man of Asia and pillaged by every passing power. We followed it through the fall of its ancient monarchy, the chaos of the generals, a war that killed tens of millions, a revolution, a famine that killed tens of millions more, and a decade of self-inflicted madness. And then, in the space of about 30 years, that same battered country clawed its way back to become the second most powerful economy in the world, lifting more human beings out of poverty more quickly than has ever been done anywhere. It is, by almost any measure, the most dramatic reversal of national fortune in modern history, a fall and a rise of such scale that it is genuinely difficult to hold both halves in your mind at once. In 2012, the leadership passed to a new figure who would carry the country into its next chapter, presiding over a China that had decisively reclaimed its place near the very centre of world affairs, much as it had occupied that place for most of recorded history before the long and painful century of weakness. The very name the Chinese have long used for their country can be translated as the Central Kingdom, the realm at the middle of everything, and after generations spent on the margins of a world that had once humbled it, that ancient sense of being at the centre of things had, in a way the old emperors could never have imagined, returned. Whether what followed would bring continued ascent, new tensions or fresh turbulence is a story still being written, and one for another night. What is certain is that the journey we have traced, from the gunboats steaming up the rivers to the skyscrapers rising over the old fishing town, ranks among the most extraordinary national sagas of the modern age, a sprawling epic of catastrophe and resilience, folly and brilliance, suffering and astonishing recovery. It is a reminder that history rarely moves in straight lines, that nations can fall further than seems survivable and rise higher than seems possible, and that the people living through each turn rarely have any idea where the road is heading. And on that thought, we will gently close the book for tonight. Thank you for keeping me company on this long voyage through a remarkable century and a half. Wherever you are, and whatever the hour, I hope you can let these stories settle softly into the quiet. Good night to every one of you, rest well, and may your dreams be sweet.